Tuesday, October 5th. And we have 3 items on our agenda for this afternoon. But before I get into that, I want to recognize a few individuals who will be with us here this afternoon. We have Eric Reed, who will be serving and has served as a longtime liaison from the New England Fishery Management Council. Not only is Eric serving as liaison, but I wanted to extend my congratulations on behalf of the council to Eric for his recent election as chair of the New England Management Council. And Eric, you know, we hope you can maintain your liaison role. You've done a great job over the years representing New England, but we can understand if the new tasks require somebody else to serve for you, but hopefully we'll be able to stick around with us for quite a while. But congratulations, Eric, on your recent election as chair. I just scrolled through the list. Oh, there's Chester. Chester Brewer, who will be also serving the South Atlantic Council as liaison for the next day and a half with us. Welcome, Chester. And so if anything comes up related to the South Atlantic, Chester can very well help us out in understanding where they might stand and provide perspective from South Atlantic on that. My name is Mike Luisi. I am the chair of the Mid-Atlantic Council, and I'll be facilitating and working through our agenda for the next day and a half. And so today we do have one change in the agenda due to some coordination and timing issues. We are going to swap out the Chub mackerel specifications with the HMS Diet Study report. So the Chub mackerel specifications we're going to start right now, and the diet study will start at 2 o'clock. And so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn to Julia to start the presentation on the Atlantic Chub mackerel specification. So Julia, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm assuming you can see this presentation just fine, so I'm going to jump right into it. Hopefully this will be pretty straightforward. It's just a review of previously implemented specifications for Chub mackerel. So my presentation will cover a high-level review of recent fishery information, summarize what the specifications are that are already on the books for 2022, and then summarize the SSC, AEP, and Monitoring Committee recommendations for those specifications. And then the objective is for the council to decide if any revisions to any of those previously approved 2022 specifications are necessary. And no changes are recommended by the SSC or the AP or the Monitoring Committee. So like I said, first I'll summarize some recent fishery information. This figure shows commercial and recreational landings over the past 20 years from Maine through North Carolina. So commercial landings are in the teal color, and you can see that after remaining below 500,000 pounds every year, and in most cases well below 500,000 pounds for several years, commercial chub mackerel landings spiked to about 5.25 million pounds in 2013, but they decreased to pre-2013 levels by 2016 and have remained very low since that time, compared to the previous peak anyway. Recreational landings are a lot lower, and especially in the earlier parts of this time series, they were somewhat sporadic in the data set. There are higher recreational landings seen in 2016 through 2020 compared to earlier years in the time series. That's kind of hard to see in this figure, but I'll delve into a little bit deeper on that on a later slide. So this figure shows the commercial landings trajectory for this year, and it's on a very similar trajectory as last year. And as of the end of September, less than 1% of the quota had been landed. So I kind of showed that in the previous figure that commercial landings have been pretty low in the recent years. A little bit more background on the commercial fishery. There's a lot of overlap with the ilex squid fishery in terms of the vessels that are responsible for the vast majority of the landings that occurred over the past 20 years are some of the same vessels that also participate in the Ilex squid fishery, and they catch chub mackerel at a very similar time of year and in some of the same areas where they also catch Ilex squid. And some of the captains who participate in both fisheries, who've provided input on this fishery in the past, have described the chub mackerel fishery as like a bailout or an alternative to the Ilex squid fishery. And they've said that in years when they can't go after Ilex, there have been, some instances where chub mackerel were available, and it was really helpful for them to be able to harvest chub mackerel when they couldn't harvest Ilex. But when they are able to go after Ilex, they would prefer to do that. And the Ilex fishery has been really good over the past few years, so that's probably a reason why the commercial chub mackerel landings have been pretty low over the past few years. So I kind of already hinted at this next bullet point that about 95% of the commercial landings over the past 20 years come from fewer than 5 vessels and fewer than 3 dealers. So it's a pretty small fishery in terms of the participants that are accounting for the majority of the landings. And so depending on how you break down the data, you also get into several situations with confidential data because of the small numbers of participants. According to federal VTRs, most of the landings are coming from bottom otter trawls, and almost all the landings are occurring from June through October. The price can be variable, but on average, it's pretty low. On average, about 51 cents per pound over the past 20 years. But in those years with the higher landings, the price tended to be a little lower and vice versa. In terms of the recreational fishery, this shows recreational harvest and discards from the MRIP program in numbers of fish over the past 20 years, again, Maine through North Carolina. So you can see that it looks like there's an increase in harvest and discards. And we have heard that there's been some improvements in reporting of chub mackerel, specifically through MRIP and in some other ways too. And we've heard some reports that it's a species that maybe more people are paying attention to. It's considered more of a warmer water species in this region, so they're more prevalent in this region in the summertime and when it's warmer. So maybe they're around more and more people are paying attention to them. So it's not entirely clear to what extent this increase in recreational catch is a real increase or just better reporting. Could be some of both, but it's hard to say the relative contribution of each of those potential factors. So for example, in 2017, chub mackerel were added to the core list of species for trainings of the MRIP field samplers from Maine through Virginia. And then also in 2019, the Council and GARCO distributed a small scombrid species ID guide that we worked together to create. We distributed that to over 3,700 commercial and recreational permit holders and other interested stakeholders. So we hope that that had some effect, but again, can't say for sure what exactly is going on with this increase in the recreational catch here. But if you focus just on the most recent 5 years in the MRIP data, it shows that about half of the harvest comes from state waters, about half from federal waters. Most of the MRIP reported harvest is from New York. About half of it is from New York, followed by Rhode Island, then New Jersey, and Connecticut. About half of it is coming from the private rental mode, 34% from the party and charter mode, and 7% from shore. And similar to the commercial fishery, most of the recreational harvest occurs through the summer and early fall. So next, I'm going to walk through the specifications that are in place for 2022. And again, the objective of the discussion today is to decide if changes to any of this are needed. So this shows the flow chart of all the catch and landings limits for chub mackerel and the values that are currently assigned to each. And I'll walk through the details on the later slides and can come back to this if you want to see how it all comes together. But starts with the ABC. We first asked the SSC to recommend an ABC for chub mackerel in July of 2018, and they agreed that insufficient information exists to assess the status and trends of chub mackerel in the Northwest Atlantic. So there's no stock assessment for this region, and it's a very data poor species. For that reason, they agreed that an OFL cannot be specified, and they recommended an ABC of 2,300 metric tons, or about 5.07 million pounds, based on their expert judgment. And they wanted to be very clear that this was based on expert judgment, not any sort of quantitative analysis. It's based loosely on the historic high for landings and assumptions about discards. It prevents the fishery from reaching its historic high, but allows for higher catch than in all other years. The SSC agreed that this ABC is unlikely to result in overfishing given the general productivity of this species worldwide, combined with low fishery capacity in this region. And they also recommended that the ABC should apply to catch from the whole East Coast, so Maine through Florida. And that's, given what we know about the distribution of the stock and the potential migratory patterns and mixing within this region. There's a lot that we don't know, but based on what we do know, the SSC thought it would be reasonable for the ABC to apply to the whole East Coast. So they reviewed this recommendation in 2020 and then again just last month. And in both instances, they did not recommend any changes. And that was the level that I was planning to cover it at. But during the discussion, Dr. Rago, I believe, is on the line and can provide more elaboration on the SSC's recommendation if it's desired. Okay, so I noted that the ABC applies to the whole East Coast, Maine through Florida. But when the council was discussing the broader management program for chub mackerel, the council did not see a need to manage the fishery in the South Atlantic through things like a permit requirement, reporting requirements, possession limits, anything like that. So they did adopt the ABC recommended by the SSC, and in order to make it so that all the rest of the management measures only apply to Maine through North Carolina, the ACL is set equal to the ABC minus expected South Carolina through Florida catch. So that's the next step in the flow chart to review is that value for expected South Carolina through Florida catch still appropriate? And the value that was previously recommended is 38 metric tons, or 84,500 pounds. And this was intended as a conservative estimate. It was based on the highest commercial and recreational landings from 1998 through 2017, increased by about 10% to account for discards, which are not quite very well documented in the South Atlantic. So it was intended to be, conservative, like I said, higher than, much higher than average, higher than what was seen in most other years. But given, uncertainties and about future fishery conditions, it was agreed that this was appropriate, acknowledging that it is a conservative estimate. But that said, it only represents about 2% of the ABC. So like I said, this value was recommended based on data through 2017. So we looked at more recent data to see if there were any changes and any trends in the fisheries in the South Atlantic. And there's very low catch in the commercial and recreational fisheries in the South Atlantic in the more recent years. So specifically, there was no MRF estimates of chub mackerel catch from South Carolina through the East Coast to Florida over the past few years. And looking at the ACCSP data for commercial landings, it's in total less than 200 pounds across 2018 through 2020. So we think that South Atlantic catch is well below this value that plays into the specifications process, but that was kind of the intent when it was implemented, that it was known at the time that this was higher than, much higher than the catch in most years. So given all that, the monitoring committee and advisory panel recommend no change to this part of the specifications for 2022. So the next step is the annual catch target, which can be set less than or equal to the ACL to account for management uncertainty. And the council previously recommended a 4% reduction in the ACL to account for management uncertainty. And this was not based on a quantitative analysis. It just kind of seemed reasonable to the council at the time, given everything else involved in the flow chart, and it just seemed appropriate. And the monitoring committee and advisory panel also recommended no change to this value for 2022. So then the last step in the flow chart is to get from the annual catch target to the total allowable landings limit. You need to subtract expected dead discards. And for all the chub mackerel catch and landings limits in that flow chart apply to commercial and recreational catch, landings, and dead discards combined. There's no separate commercial and recreational catch and landings limits for chub mackerel. And the way that the expected dead discards value was recommended in the past, it was based only on commercial data, given that over the past 20 years, most of the landings occurred in the commercial fishery. And it was based on a pretty simple percentage approach, because at this point in time, we don't have any expanded dead discard estimates for chub mackerel. So for example, we don't have any official SBRM discard estimates for chub mackerel at this point in time. So the way that this was recommended in the past was just looking at the overall percentage of dead discards that were shown in the observer data. And it was based on a table really similar to what's shown here. So of all the observed chub mackerel catch, what percentage of it was discarded over the past 15, 10, and 5 years, as well as the top 3 years and the highest year for catch. And then there's also VTR data shown for comparison, but the recommendation was based on observer data, given that the council felt more confident in that data. So this is the updated table, updated through 2020. The recommendation that was previously implemented was to use this to 6%, so to reduce the ACT by 6% to get to the TAL. You can see that in more recent years. So if you look at the 2016 through 2020 row in the table, you can see it's much higher than 6%. But again, those are years with very low catch overall. And in any of the years that on this table that incorporate those years with higher landings, you can see that the percentages are, on the order of 6% or lower, or in one case slightly higher. And the monitoring committee and the advisory panel recommended no changes to the 6% discard assumption to get from the ACT to the TAL, despite this higher percentage shown in more recent years. And that's because the ABC is loosely based on the year with the highest catch, and it's a percentage approach. So, if you applied 43%, for example, to a value that's based on the historic high, it blows up to a huge number of pounds. So given that the overall specifications flowchart is highly based on years with the higher landings and probably the highest targeted fishing effort, the monitoring committee and advisory panel thought it was appropriate to leave this unchanged at 6%. So the next set of management measures are possession limits. There's no recreational possession limit for chub mackerel, and the commercial possession limits only come into effect after a certain percentage of the total allowable landings limit has been projected to be landed. So first, there would be a 40,000 pound commercial possession limit after 90% of the total allowable landings limit is projected to be landed. And that number is based on input from people who are familiar with the fisheries, suggesting that it kind of strikes a balance between not being high enough that there would be any incentive to target chub mackerel, but if fishermen did catch some chub mackerel incidentally, there would be an incentive. It's high enough to minimize discards. Like it's high enough that it would be worth it to land what you catch incidentally, but not high enough that anybody would go out and target chub mackerel, was the theory. And then after 100% of the TAL is projected to be landed, then there would be a 10,000 pound possession limit, which was roughly the average trip level landings over the past 20 years through 2017. And if those top vessels are excluded, it covers almost all of the trips. So again, just looked at data since 2017, and it showed very similar trends. The average and the 99th percentile are very closely in line with what was previously implemented. So given that nothing really seems to have changed with our understanding of this compared to how the decisions were made when these were first implemented, the monitoring committee and advisory panel recommend no change to any of the possession limits either. So the last thing that was discussed by the advisory panel and the monitoring committee was the idea of a recreational minimum size limit. So you may recall that there's some consideration related to a recreational minimum size limit for Atlantic mackerel through the Rebuilding 2.0 framework. And there was some discussion in the past council meetings about if there's a recreational minimum size limit considered for Atlantic mackerel, should the same thing be considered for chub mackerel, given that they look very similar? Would it make the Atlantic mackerel size limit more effective if just the same exact thing was implemented for chub mackerel? So there was some interest, some council members in hearing what the AP had to say about that. This wasn't something that, has been explicitly recommended by the council for consideration, but there was some interest in thinking more about it. So we did ask the AP and they did not recommend this. Some advisors spoke very strongly against this. There was concerns about it would just lead to dead discards, and it didn't seem like it would really be a helpful change. The monitoring committee also talked about it, and they wanted to be clear that they weren't recommending for or against it, but they did discuss some relevant considerations. So, for example, one monitoring committee member said that monitoring and enforcement of an Atlantic mackerel recreational size limit may be more effective if the same size limit also applied to chub mackerel, so similar to what I said earlier. So for example, it could improve compliance with the Atlantic mackerel size limit. It would avoid incentives to misreport. So for example, if someone knew that there was a minimum size limit for Atlantic mackerel, but not chub mackerel, maybe to some extent, there would be some intentional misreporting of Atlantic mackerel as chub mackerel. Not trying to say that this would happen to any large degree, but it could occur. And if the same size limit applied, then that wouldn't be an issue. And it could lead to better confidence in the data used to monitor the catch of both species if there's just consistency in the regulations across the two species. However, on the other hand, the monitoring committee noted that the conservation benefits of a recreational minimum size limit for either species would be questionable given the high discard mortality rate for both species. So if a recreational minimum size limit just forces anglers to discard fish below a certain size, and if most of those fish die anyway, it may not have that much of a benefit. So there's one more thing that the advisors talked about that I wanted to touch on. Most of the recommendations I kind of incorporated into the earlier slide, because for the specifications across the board, they recommended no changes for 2022. But they also talked about research priorities, and some of this will make a little more sense after you see the next presentation on the HMS Diet Study. But Dr. Golette, who is going to present to the council at 2 o'clock, he also presented to the AP and to the SSC. So we're very grateful for that. I think it was very helpful for the SSC and the AP to be able to hear directly from him and ask questions of him. And 3 advisory panel members said that they thought that his research was very rigorous and conclusive, and no additional research is needed on chub mackerel and the diets of highly migratory species, which again, maybe that statement will make a little more sense after you see the next presentation on the agenda. But one advisor also said that Dr. Golet's findings on the importance of ilex squid and bullet and frigate mackerel may warrant further exploration, because those are species that the council is interested in for different reasons. Kind of following up on that, another advisor said he did not recommend the council funding additional research on the importance of ilex squid in the diets of highly migratory species. And he said this can be addressed in other ways without council funding. So that's all I had. And again, the point of discussion for today is, does the council see a need to change any of the previously recommended specifications for 2022? And the SSC, the advisory panel, and the monitoring committee all recommend no changes for 2022. And if you do not want any changes, then we do not need a motion for chub mackerel today. And that's all I had. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And I think that's a great point. 2022 specifications are already in place. This would be an opportunity to change something. And as Julia mentioned, the SSC, AP, and monitoring committee all recommended no changes. So just keep that in mind as we go through questions and answers here for Julia. I'm sure there'll be some. Does anyone from the council have any questions they'd like to ask of Julia at this time based on the presentation? Any questions? Any comment? Okay, seeing no questions or comment from members of the council, let me turn to the public to see if there are any questions or comment based on the presentation that Julia just provided. James Fletcher.
Thank you. Everything we're doing, we need to look at as a minimum, very minimum for these species. We don't have the information. When are we going to get some decent information on these species that travel from the South Africa and below all the way up, and we're on the minimum part of the range? Why is the council spending time on fish that are very rarely caught? Someone explain to me why we're spending time on these fish rather than something that is economically important like scup, black sea bass, striped bass, and other species. Please explain it to me. I'm sitting here I'm been in this for 40 years, and I don't understand why we run to this or deep sea coral or whatever. Why are we going that? Who's sending it? The council, NIPS? Who's bringing up these odd issues? Thank you.
Julia, do you want to take a crack at it, or do you want me to try to help answer James' question?
Either way is fine. I pulled up this slide because I thought it was relevant.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to pull up this slide. I think, you know, it was the spike in harvest in 2013 that really started driving an interest by the council at determining management actions for the conservation of these fish, which are important as a forage base for a lot of our species. And so, James, that's where the interest came before the council. It had to do with that increase in landings, which at the time was lucrative to those individuals who were fishing in that fishery. I know there were just a few. So it's dropped since, and we haven't had very many landings in recent years, but it doesn't mean it won't happen again. And the council had an interest in protecting these fish as a basis of forage and wanted to maintain some level of control over those unregulated landings at, back in 2013 and further into the future. So I don't know, Julie, do you have anything you want to add to that as far as why the council is engaged in this species?
Nope, I think that covers it.
Okay. All right. Anyone else from the public have any questions, comments for either me, Julia, or Chris? All right. Seeing no other interest from members of the public, I'm going to bring it back to the council, and I'll ask one last time. Are there any questions or comments from any members of the council at this time? Michelle Duvall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Julia had answered one of the questions that I had, which was just about the 4% management buffer, but I know this might not be a question that could be answered, but it's just about I was curious about the increasing discards. And I know that, it's a small number of vessels that have been responsible for most of the commercial harvest of Chub mackerel. I just wasn't sure if you're able to identify, that by specific fishery. I mean, I was just assuming that it was the squid fishery, but was curious if you had any more information on that.
Thanks for the question. No, I didn't dig into it really any more than this table, but I could. One thing that's a little misleading about this is that it doesn't really get at like the volume, like, so it's in 2016 through 2020, it's 43%, which is a high percent, but it's a percentage of a much, much lower volume than something like 2013 through 2015, which was kind of shown in that figure that I flipped back to a minute ago. So I think that's just assuming that's a big part of it, is that there's a lot less targeting in recent years compared to, for example, 2013 through 2015, where those were years with more targeting. And this is just taking the approach of like, you know, whatever time period, it's lumping the entire catch together across all vessels, you know, all observed chub mackerel catch, kind of lumping it all together. But I could definitely dig into it a little deeper. But I think the biggest thing that's going on here is, you know, targeting versus not targeting and the overall scale of the catch.
Thanks for that, Julia. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Thanks for the question, Michelle. Okay, seeing no hands at this time. Julia mentioned as part of her last slide that no changes have been recommended, so therefore we do not need to take action. Is there any objection to maintaining the status quo? Not status quo, but maintaining the current 2022 specifications moving forward? Any objection from any member of the council? Okay, seeing no objection, Julia will move forward with the 2022 specifications as already in place with no changes recommended by the council. Is there anything else to come before the council at this point on chub mackerel?
From the staff perspective, that's all we need.
Okay. All right, well, that concludes our business under this agenda item. Thank you, Julia, for your presentation. We had planned to start our discussion on the HMS Diet Study report at 2 o'clock. Chris, I just ran through the list. I don't see Dr. Gillette on the list of participants at this time. Do you want to just break till 2, since he's probably planning to get on right before 2?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think we're going to have to do that. I don't see him on the list either. Walt had a problem with 1 o'clock, said he was available at 2. So
okay,
I think that's all we can do at this point. Take a break.
Okay. Yeah, let's take a break. I'll come back in a half an hour at 2 o'clock, and we'll pick up with the diet study report by Dr. Walcolette. Thanks so much, everyone. See you back in a half an hour. Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's 2 o'clock. I'd like to get started with the next item on our agenda. We have with us this afternoon Dr. Walt Gillette from the University of Maine, Gulf of Maine Research Institute. Dr. Gillette has been working on a council-funded project to determine the diet of yellowfin, big-eyed tunas, white and blue marlin, with the goal of understanding the role of chub mackerel in these diets. And so he's going to be presenting his findings. There is no final report that I'm aware of at this point, but we look forward to seeing that down the road. But Dr. Gillette, welcome. And whenever you are ready to begin your presentation, you may begin. Thanks for being here with us today.
Great, absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. And as I was mentioning to Julia, so some of our genetic barcoding was derailed a little with COVID. Unfortunately, my colleague had the unlucky misfortune of having about 5 infections in his lab, which shut him down. But all those results are in, and we are actually in the process of finalizing that report, which we will distribute to you. And as I shared with Julia as well, you are welcome to all of the photos and data sets that we have for the project. So that will be forthcoming. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Get started. Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Yeah, it's coming through fine on my end.
Okay, perfect. All right, great. All right, thank you. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, Julia in particular, for making arrangements to change up the time. I'm sorry, I had some personal stuff come through, and I had to kind of rearrange my schedule a little bit. So I do apologize to everybody in attendance today, and I do thank you for your patience. So what I'd like to do for you today is give you a kind of an overview of the project that we were funded by the council to do regarding the foraging ecology of tunas and marlins, in the Western and North Atlantic. And of course, the focus is going to be on the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And before I get into the actual project itself and all of the ins and outs and the things that we did, I do want to acknowledge a lot of co-authors on this. Riley Austin, who's a graduate student, Isabel C., who's a technician in my lab, Zach Whitener, who's a technician at GMRI, and a whole host of other interns and undergraduates and other graduate students that helped get this project to where it is. For those of you who haven't done stomach analysis or diet work, it's a tedious exercise, but it's also a very rewarding one. And it takes sort of an all hands on deck approach. And I could not have done this without the help of everybody involved. So again, I just wanted to acknowledge them and thank them for their contributions. So if any of you have any questions after this presentation is over, I've put my email up on here as well as the office phone number. Feel free to reach out to me at any point in time with anything that I may not have covered today or a question that may have come up after the fact. And again, be on the lookout for that final report, which will be heading Julia's way very soon now that we have all those genetics samples back. Okay, just a little bit. I'm not sure. Again, I don't know the background and experience of everybody in the audience. So what I thought I would do is just give you a little bit of information, a little bit of background information on the marlin fisheries in the United States, since that was the main directive for this project. All of the marlins, at least the ones that we're familiar with and that are popular in our sport fishing recreational components, are managed by the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, or ICAT, which is the regional fishery management organization that is in the Atlantic. They, of course, oversee not only the marlins, but the tunas, tuna-like species, sharks, some of the pelagic sharks, and so forth. Some interesting aspects of the marlin fisheries in the Atlantic, especially in the Atlantic, is they are for recreational purposes only. There is no commercial fishery or commercial sale of marlins in the continental United States, regardless of the type of gear that you catch them on, regardless of where you catch them or anything of that nature. We are only allowed to catch them basically through recreational gears and for recreational purposes. There are some exceptions for Hawaii, but again, that's not in the Atlantic. Another sort of restricting factor on us, at least in terms of our ability to collect lots of samples, and that's kind of what my lab is known for, is collecting lots and lots of samples, is we have retention limits, annual retention limits on not necessarily the weight of the marlins that we can keep, but the individuals in totality. And so between Maine and Texas, although we don't have any marlins in Maine yet, between Maine and Texas, we are allowed, the United States is allowed 250 individuals, so blues, whites, and round scale spearfish on an annual basis. And again, that's a pretty big spatial area. You're talking from Texas all the way up the East Coast of the United States, and there are lots and lots of tournaments that are held each year. Some of them are catch and release, and some of them are kill tournaments. But fortunately for us, the main spatial area in question is in fact centered almost exclusively right where some of these larger kill tournaments take place. And so it was advantageous for us to be able to get samples for this project. And I would also say that we sort of married this project, looking specifically at the presence of chub mackerel in marlins, with some other existing and ongoing sampling that we had been doing for tropical tunas, namely yellowfin tuna and big eye tuna, in the same locations, from the same tournaments, and also from the pelagic longline. So just to bring everybody back to what the goal, or actually the objective of the project was, and that was to evaluate the importance, of chub mackerel, Scomber off the mid-Atlantic bight. And the way that we were going to do this was pretty standard. We've used methodologies that are formally accepted and have been used for decades now. The two that we chose are stomach content analysis. And if you're not familiar with this, basically stomach content analysis gives you a snapshot in time of what an individual is consuming. That snapshot in time varies depending on the metabolism of the animal, whether or not, for example, they're like a bluefin tuna that has a warm stomach, or if they're a fish that does not. And so digestion rates differ between animals and organisms, and retention times in the gut and so forth. But stomach content analysis is a great way to understand what animals are eating. You basically are evaluating what is in the gut based on several indices or several metrics, first of which is morphological characteristics, and then some hard parts identification, and then genetic barcoding. And I'll get into all of that in just a little bit. So that's pretty standard. There are some other techniques that you can use, mainly stable isotopes, but those really didn't apply to this project. Stable isotopes will give you some idea of what animals are eating based on their chemistry. And if you use different tissue types, you'll get different temporal aspects of that diet. But the difficulty is sometimes you can't isolate the isotopic signature to a specific species. So you end up with like guilds and groups. So this is the methodologies that we chose for this particular one. So in the summertime, what we did is myself and my staff went to the two major tournaments. Those would be the White Marlin Open, which it takes place generally, I think it's right around the third week of July. And that is in Ocean City, Maryland. And then the Mid-Atlantic, which takes place also in Ocean City, Maryland, but also has a weigh-in station in Cape May, New Jersey. The Marlins are subject to federal minimum regulations. So lower jaw fork lengths that are imposed by federal mandates, but sometimes the tournaments will impose their own lower limits, which increases that size, but also decreases your ability to sample the fish because not as many come in. So all of the marlins that came in, and for as many of the tunas as we could, sometimes they don't want you to cut the tunas open, they want to take them back. We would collect just basic biological information. We collect the length of the animal, the weight of the animal. Every animal is weighed round. What the sex of that individual was, the species, and of course location. And I'll get into location a little bit. For some of these organisms, for some of these individual species, we have very good location data. And then in other instances, that location data is sort of related to a sort of 100 nautical mile cone, or from this canyon to this canyon, based on tournament regulations. The idea is that once these fish came in, we would excise the stomach from the guts. And what we want to do is we want to retard degradation and continue digestion as much as we can. So as soon as those stomachs are retrieved from the animal, we bag them, we label them, we get them on ice immediately, and then we get them into a freezer as quickly as we can for post-analysis back in the lab. Once we bring those stomachs back to the lab, they're slowly thawed out. Once they're slowly thawed out, we carefully open up the stomachs. We remove the bulk contents as much as we can for anything that's stuck in the stomach lining, and there is often a lot of stuff stuck in the stomach lining depending on the fullness of the gut. We use a series of fine mesh sieves that we rinse the stomach contents over so that we catch all the little bits and pieces, whether they're bone fragments, whether they're squid beaks or otoliths that come out of those stomachs for later identification. And as I said before, the primary way we identify what's in these stomachs is basically through visual characteristics, or in this case, morphological characteristics. So what does the prey look like? In general, its colorations, its patterns, its shape, its tails, number of spines, and so forth. We identify these individuals to the lowest taxonomic level that we possibly can. And we do so usually through consensus so that we're in agreement that, yes, in fact, this is what it is. In cases where we're a little unsure, we always err on the side of caution, and we'll go to the next highest taxonomic level. So, for example, we may not all agree that it is, this particular species of cephalopod. And so if we can't identify it with confidence to that species level, we bring it back up one taxonomic level, and or we can actually take a piece of tissue and send it out for genetic verification, which we also did. In the event, and this happens a lot, in the event that those morphological characteristics are compromised, which digestion tends to do rather quickly, we can utilize other pieces of material that can be used as identifiers for those particular prey items, namely the hard parts. So when we describe hard parts, generally we're talking about the sagittal otoliths and the beaks, the chitin material, both of which, the calcium carbonate and the chitin, are generally resistant to digestion. Not completely, but their breakdown is much slower, and they usually will retain a lot of the protuberances or shapes that you can use to later then identify or link them to a particular species. So that's the second way that we can do that identification. And then finally, if all else fails and we just simply can't identify what it is based on its characteristics, there are no hard parts to identify in the stomach or in the tissue, and all you end up with, and I'll use my scientific terms here, the goop, basically the material that's just left over in the stomach, we can actually sample, take an aliquot of that tissue out, try to isolate it as best we can from the core of that goop, put it into a fixative, and then we can send it out for genetic barcoding. And the idea there is that the genetic barcoding can do two things. It can verify the species identification that you have given it initially. And secondly, if you cannot identify what that animal is, it can give you an idea of what it is. Now, I will put in the caveat that you do have to do a little QA/QC on this. We have had returns of genetic barcoded animals, and sometimes they come back as bacteria because there's been a contamination issue with the tissue. Sometimes they've come back as species from the Pacific and so forth. So you can have misclassifications, and you really have to look at your probability assignments in order to determine with confidence, whether or not those animals are in fact what they are. So that is all fleshed out as well. So that's kind of the methodologies. Again, just to give you a little bit of a flavor and show you some of the pictures from the actual stomachs. We bring these back. We have these nice sorting tables that we put these animals on. You can see this. Hopefully you can see my cursor. I don't know if you can, but hopefully you can. In the upper left-hand panel, you can see these nice fine mesh sieves. And actually, if you look closely there, you can see some actually lenses, eye lenses, I believe, from some of the cephalopods. You can see some of the squid beaks here. These are lenses. These are the pens from the squids. Same thing with any of the fishes that we would collect. And what we'll do is when we open up that stomach, we try to sort of bulk organize things, put your molluscas here, put your chordates here, put your amphipods or amphipoda over here, and start with coarse classification. And then from there, sort of get your classifications into tighter and tighter groups, or finer and finer groups. The stomachs that we sampled for this ran the spectrum from being completely homogeneous. You might have all sorts of short fin squids in one, like we see in this left-hand panel. It might be a mix of material, maybe some cephalopods and some teleost fish. It might be all fish. And as you can see in these panels, these prey items are in various states of digestion. Some of them you can identify rather easily by looking at them. Others may only have a head section, but no tail, or no head, but the tail. And every single item that we collect from these stomachs. If it is intact enough, we will take a mantle length from the cephalopods, and we'll take a total length from any of the fishes, as well as a carapace length from all of the crustaceans. If we don't have the ability to measure every item with respect to its length, everything is still weighed. And it's weighed as either an identified product or it's grouped into an unidentified pool, like unidentified mollusks, for example. The other thing is that we keep, just because of the way that I'm always worried that we're going to throw something out, we actually keep all of the prey species from each one of the stomachs as well. And so you'll see that, they get bagged in these little whirl packs and then archived in our walk-in freezer. In the event that you cannot use those morphological characteristics that I just described, sometimes you can have the head still intact or the beak is still intact, and you can go into that animal and you can extract those hard parts. And so for those of you, I'm assuming most people are familiar with otoliths and squid beaks, but they basically act as a fingerprint, if you will, a species fingerprint. And you can use them, so long as they haven't been compromised too much, to actually trace back what animal they actually originated from. And they come in all different, shapes and sizes. They do change ontogenetically, so as these organisms grow, the otolith morphology will change a little bit. You have to be aware of that and know how that otolith morphology does change. But we have a pretty good record for that. And what we would do is we basically would identify all of the individual otoliths, assign each of them a specific number, and do the same thing with the beaks. And then once we do that, we can set up these reference keys where we can, take pictures or snapshots of the different otoliths, and we can confirm that they are in fact from, for example, medusa fish or flying fish or barracudinas. And those are our reference sets that we use throughout this entire process. And one of the neat things, so chub mackerel are on here, and you can see the chub mackerel, they have what we call the bow tie otoliths. They almost look like a little bow tie here because they have kind of this indentation. So they're nice in the sense that they have a very unique otolith shape, and they're very easy to identify. In addition to the otoliths, we do the same thing with the squid beaks. I do not claim to be an expert in cephalopod identification at all. We basically, myself and my lab, we kind of come together and try to look at these and identify them to the lowest taxonomic level that we can with confidence. Occasionally we can do that really well, and we can say, yes, this is a strawberry squid, this is a 7-armed octopus or a longfin squid. And then in other cases, it may be a result of the sample just being a little bit compromised, or maybe perhaps we're seeing just something a little bit different between the different identifications that the individuals do. And so we might only be able to put that into the ilex column. And then finally, as you can see in this picture, you have on the right-hand side sort of some of this, this just material, this loose material. And we would take a small aliquot of that, and then we would send that off. And I think we barcoded somewhere around 900 individual tissue samples. And again, sometimes that was used for verification that yes, in fact, this is a 7-armed octopus, this is a lanternfish. And then in other cases, it was used to try to determine what that potential blob was in the diet of those animals. So where did we sample? We had both sort of onshore ports that we sampled from, as well as offshore platforms in the pelagic longline fishery. The red dots are representative. The lowest red dot is Ocean City, Maryland. That, again, was where the White Marlin tournament took place, as well as one port for the Mid-Atlantic. Cape May, New Jersey, which is the second red dot from the bottom, that was where we had the way station for one of two landing areas for the Mid-Atlantic. I have been working with some of the larger charter boats off of the coast of New Jersey the last several years, and I've purchased and placed strategically chest freezers where these boats can actually place the samples that they get from offshore, and we can come and pick them up. So the boats will come in, they'll loin out the tunas, for example, they'll throw the whole racks into the freezer, we can come and pick them up and then do the analysis that we need to. And then this last red dot here was an opportunistic sampling event. It was off of Martha's Vineyard. It was for an HMS tournament. And so we got some samples from that one. No marlins from this one, and no marlins from these top two dots. These were all tunas. All of the black dots are representative of individual pelagic longline sets. Most of them are on the west side of the stream. Some of them were from the eastern side of the stream, right here as well. They're not going to give you the exact location of where the fish were captured, but they give you an approximate location of where those fish were landed. And then again, for these tournament sites, you basically can imagine a cone that sort of comes out to here. This is the Hudson Canyon, and then, you know, maybe it goes down to Norfolk Canyon. And so that would be the sort of zone that you would infer where these fish were caught. We didn't have exact latitude and longitudes for these, but in general, we're in that same spatial region that was identified as the high priority area by the council to do this work. So this is a summary of all of the samples that we collected for this project for yellowfin and big eye tuna. We have a sampling event, and please don't confuse. I apologize. I noticed once the table, a graduate student of mine set this table. It's a little bit confusing. Don't conflict or rather confuse the sampling event with a month of the year. It's just a numerical way that they set this up. It doesn't have anything to do with date. But here we have the year, the gear, the region, and all of the specifics, and then the species. And then you can see here on these trips, for example, you know, on trip number 3 in 2018, we sampled 14 big eyes and 58 yellowfin tunas. The next trip here had 0 big eyes, but 47 yellowfins, and so forth. You'll notice there are a few zeros in there. That's kind of an artifact of fishing. You don't always get into all of the different species, of course. Sometimes they're more abundant than others, and it depends on both the time of year and where they're making the sets, any depredation that occurs, and things of that sort. We sampled over 1,000 stomachs from yellowfin and big eye tuna. We had 758 stomachs that actually had contents. And if you're familiar with stress responsive fish, when they bite a line, one of the first things that they often do is they throw up. They will regurgitate. Marlins, in fact, can actually throw their stomach, so they can completely invert it out of their body and then back again. So we were pretty fortunate, though. You know, of the 1,000, we ended up with just shy of 800 stomachs that we could analyze. So that was actually really good. And if anybody has any questions along the way, or if there's a clarifying or to the point question, I'm happy to take those as well. Or if you'd rather save it to the end, either way. So what I did here is we broke up our dietary components into 3 major phylums. So we have Arthropoda, we have Chordata, and then on the next page we have our mollusca. I'll go back to this one here. And then we identify, if we can identify that particular item to a family, we do so. And then within that family, if we can identify it to a species, again, we will try that. But you'll notice that not every family has a species. And again, that's just an artifact of not being able to identify it to a lower taxonomic level. There may have been something wrong with the prey item. There may be components or parts of it that we just could not identify. Every single family, every single phylum, and then every single family, and then every single species within each of these has its own weight contribution, the number of individuals, and then 2 metrics that we use for importance in the diet. And there's several that you can use, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm using 2. One is % frequency of occurrence. That's basically telling you how often you would find a particular prey item in the stomachs. So out of 100 stomachs, how many of them would you find the Euphausidae? Or how many would you find Hypheridae? And then you have % mean weight, which is going to give you more of an idea of volume. So how much actual material or space, if you will, is that particular prey item taking up in that stomach? And they're a little bit different metrics, and they tell you a little bit different things. For example, you could have portunids, the swimming crabs, present in all 100 stomachs, but you might only have 1 crab present in every stomach. Whereas I don't know, let's just pick something here. You know, maybe you have the monacanthids that are present in only 50% of the stomachs, but they account for 80% of the weight, which means that predator is consuming a lot of them. That's a very big energetic component of their diet. So as we go through, what I'll do is I'll highlight some of these different metrics that we had. So in terms of yellowfin tuna, the arthropods are found in about half of the stomachs, but as you can see, in terms of % weight, they're actually minimal. The chordates are going to be in almost 80% of our stomachs, and I'll try to use my cursor here, almost 80% of your stomachs, and about 50% of the stomach weight, and then we'll just shift to the mollusks here, which are going to be in about 80% of the stomachs and about 40% of the mean weight. And then we can dive down a little bit deeper for each of these. Again, we can go into these individual families, and we can go into these individual species when it's appropriate. I would draw your attention to the fact that we have some families and some species that are bold in all of these tables that we'll be going through. In those cases, the bolded families were identified either exclusively with that genetic barcoding technique that I told you about, or if it's in the case of species, they're identified either through that genetic barcoding or gross morphological identification with genetic barcoding as the confirmation. So as we go through these, you'll see a lot of bolded families and species. And I just wanted to point out that that genetic barcoding component of this was a really important part of this project, and it enabled us to identify a lot more than we would have with sort of standard methods. If you scroll down in the core data, so let's go down to core data and let's go down to our species of interest, what we're looking for, and that is within the Scombridae family, we are looking for Scombricoleus, which is right here. Out of all the dietary items, we found 2. So we found 2 chub mackerel in the diet or in the stomachs of all of these yellowfin tunas over the course of a couple of years in this region. Let me go to, let me go to the next one. Okay, so big eye tuna. Big eye tuna diets were a little bit different than yellowfin. They relied a little bit more heavily on the short fin squids, as we'll see here in just a second. The arthropods, all the arthropod representatives were quite small. They were only in about 15% of the stomachs, and their mean weight was negligible. I mean, it was less than 1%. So as opposed to yellowfin, that is not any substantial component of their diet. Chordates much more, and if we look at some of the species here, you can see their relative contributions in terms of the amount of weight that they contribute, and also how much of the percent mean weight or the percent frequency of occurrence that they occurred. But if we were to look, again, if we were to look to see where chub mackerel falls out in this, we'd go under Scombridae, and you can find that there were none. So of the, I think 180 or 190 big-eyed tuna stomachs that we looked at, we didn't find a single chub mackerel in any of the big-eyed tuna stomachs. Again, just to highlight, mollusks were a big component of big-eyed tuna diets. They were found in 90% of the stomachs, and they contributed about 66-67% of the weight. This is not unheard of. If you're familiar with the vertical behaviors of big-eyed tuna, they're very predictable. It's not to say that they don't come up during the day, because they do. I mean, I fish for them, other people fish for them. You can catch them during the day, but they do spend considerable time at depth, and it's thought that a lot of their time is spent sort of around or following that deep scattering layer, which is filled with barracudinas and lanternmictophids and lanternfishes and so forth. So it's not surprising that their diet differs from yellowfin. They're in a different vertical niche most of the time. So that's not uncommon. Okay, so now to the marlins. So again, we sampled for 3 years, 2018, 2019, and 2020. You'll notice that our sampling effort in 2020 was greatly reduced from the other 2 years. Not surprising, given the fact that COVID hit just before we were about to go down there. So it hit in, I think, March or April. My university, as well as I think pretty much every university, shut down. We were not allowed to travel. So all of our ability to go out of state, to go to these tournaments, was not approved. I went down in 2020 by myself, not as a University of Maine employee, but just as a personal friend and colleague to some of the people that are at the tournament. And while I was there, I was able to collect a handful of stomachs. Not many, mind you, but we were able to add a few to this data set. So we ended up with 17 blue marlin stomachs, 36 white marlin stomachs, and 44 round scale spearfish, which, if you have not seen them before, they look almost identical to a white marlin, with some morphological differences between the dots on the dorsal fin and the distance between the vent and the anal fin, but they look almost identical. Found about 1,000 different prey items, and you can see sort of the differences in the prey weights there. We also did some opportunistic sampling when we were allowed to, and it's not often, but when we were allowed to, some people did allow us to cut out the stomachs from albacore and yellowfin tuna while we were there. And then some of the fish cutters also saved us the stomachs from things, but they didn't remember what it was that they saved it from. So we do have a few in what we call the unknown category. All right, so now we're going to look at blue marlins. Same thing, all the same metrics here. We have, again, bold species that were identified through genetic barcoding. So that genetic barcoding was very helpful to us. And then again, broken up into the arthropods, the chordates, and the mollusks. And you can see that the blue marlins are almost exclusively feeding on chordates. And some of the biggest contributors are going to be in the Scombridae family. But you'll notice that it's not going to be chub mackerel. Okay, it's going to be the bullet tunas and things like that are going to comprise the largest component of the blue marlin diet. And there are some mollusks, but again, very minimal. You can definitely see that blue marlins are really keen in on some of these other chordates, and in particular, usually around the bullet tunas. We did the same thing for the 35 white marlin stomachs, and you'll notice here similar, but a little bit more reliance on short fin squids for the white marlins. But you can see that, again, arthropods were very minimal, especially in percent weight, less than 1%. But we had a lot of chordates, and many of them were going to be the scombrids. We did find a total of 8 chub mackerel here in white marlin stomachs. This was 2 different white marlin stomachs, and I apologize. I saw a couple people on the list that were in my previous presentations. I think I might have said 7, but we went back through the data and we actually found 8, not 7. So we clarified that in this table. So over the course of 2 years and 35 stomachs, we found 2 chub mackerel. And then, of course, you can see a fairly good amount of consumption for the mollusca, most of them the omestrephids, and in particular, it's going to be the short fin squids that comprise the largest component of their diets. And then we'll finish that up with the round scale spearfish, again, very similar. And we didn't have any of the arthropods in here, almost exclusively for percent frequency of occurrence and percent mean weight. The chordates, and again, the largest contributors are going to be these scombrids. A little bit more diversity in the scombrids, and in fact, believe it or not, we had some blackfin tunas that were identified in the stomachs of the round scale spearfish, and we had some bluefin tuna. So Atlantic bluefin tuna were actually consumed by round scales as well, and you can see that they are bolded, which means that we genetically verified their identification. We did it with the gill rakers as well, but we also sent it out for a verification just to be sure, because we thought it was a little odd that they were eating bluefin, but they are in fact eating bluefin tuna. And then you can see the importance of the mollusca in here, and again, short fin squid pretty much dominate that group of organisms that was consumed by this group of animals. This represents the unique prey items that were identified by genetic barcoding and hard parts from the marlins. So had we not utilized both the hard parts and the genetic barcoding, these individuals would not have been found. So in the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it was like nine different species there that we actually found through genetic barcoding that we wouldn't have found otherwise. And then we have 4 different species there that we found only from the hard parts, generally the squids, generally the beaks. So that was another interesting part of the diet analysis, basically the blending of these different techniques to find some stuff that you might ordinarily not find. This is a heat map, and it's basically going to show you those 12 sampling events and the importance of different dietary items. So we found a lot of different dietary items in these animals. But if you really drill down and look at the importance of those individuals, again, based on that metric of mean weight, you'll see that for the most part, the Scombridae, for yellowfin tuna anyway, the Scombridae and the omestraphid squids, a little bit in the monacanthids and the Hypheridae and salvidae, that regardless of sampling event, that's pretty much the species that comprises the majority of their diet. That's where on the heat map they're sort of lighting up the most. The big eyes, you'll notice we only had sampling events 9 and 12. That's because most of the big eye we captured were in fact caught on the pelagic longline vessels in the fall, and it was only on a couple trips. And again, just like we highlighted in that table before, those Omostrepid squids are going to be the area that lights up the most, with a little bit of the lantern fishes below, some monacanthids and salps and so forth. So what that tells us is that even across sort of that temporal spectrum, even though the sampling event 1 through 12 is not correlated or related to a particular month, those were spread out in time for the tunas, and we see fairly consistent dietary patterns for those animals. Gear type, same thing. No selectivity differences between whether you're catching these individuals on rod and reel, which is what RR designates, or long line, which is LL. Again, the Omostrepids and the Scombridaes, number 1 and number 2, monacanthids coming in 3 there in terms of their importance in the diet. So gear type didn't seem to matter. It's probably what's available in the most abundance offshore at the time, and that's what they're keying in on. Looking at some interannual differences of the marlins, you know, how does the diet compare one year to the next? And we've noticed that for the most part, it's pretty consistent. The Omostrepids, you know, there's a little bit of difference in terms of your mean weights. We have some unidentified categories here, which are very similar, but that doesn't tell you much, except that, you know, there was some components of the diet we couldn't identify. I guess the good thing is it's about the same between years, so there's no bias there or anything related to how probably we were handling the samples. It seems that what was unidentified in terms of the percent mean weight one year is very similar to the next. It's probably indicative of you know, maybe the digestion of the animals or how long it was, you know, taking to process them or things like that. But it seems consistent, I guess, is my point. And then, of course, the Scombridaes, you know, they're very similar, somewhere between 30 and 40 in the mean weight category. So very consistent between 2018 and 2019. Again, very minor differences with some of these, the monacanthids and the Carangidaes and things like that, but not much. Very consistent. One of the other things that we were interested in is how do, like, for example, a lot of these stomachs come in and they come in with just hard parts. You know, most of the tissue is degraded. So we did a little bit of a comparison between what you would find based on tissues versus what you would find if you only identified hard parts. And obviously you can see that for some species like the Omostrepid squids, the presence of beaks in the in the diet, or excuse me, in the stomach, is very well represented, whether it's just in the stomach lying there or if it's physically removed from the animals. Whereas in a lot of cases, for example, the top third of this figure, most of those animals are being identified based on tissues. So you really need the tissues. You can't obviously rely just on the hard parts. Identification of hard parts alone will only work for a very select group of prey species. Other than that, you really need all that other tissue, whether you identify it through those visual characteristics or whether you identify it through some other method like genetic barcoding. You have to have it. So this was big eye. So for this one was yellowfin tuna. This one was big eye tuna. Again, very similar story, although we see a little bit more agreement with the big eye tunas, probably just, again, that might be related to their vertical distribution and what they're feeding on and the consistency with which they're feeding on it. But you can see with the, you know, with the myctophids, or excuse me, with the Omostrepid squids, again, it's very similar. But that one and maybe the Gimplidaes, those are the ones that are the only 2 or 3 there that are probably similar. The rest are quite different. Okay, so then we looked at interannual differences of yellowfin tuna by percent frequency at sampling sites. And again, between 2018 and 2019, we see similar patterns with the Omostrepids and the Hypheridaes, all the way down until you kind of start to get down here. And then we do see some rather stark differences, but in terms of interannual dietary differences. Lots of salps consumed in 2019, megalops, Scombridaes, and so forth in much higher percentages, or they were occurring in much higher percentages of the stomachs in 2019 than in 2018. So we did see some interannual differences with some of these species, which is not uncommon. The ocean's dynamic, things are changing. It's not surprising that you would see these differences. And then I guess the last part of this, I've got just a couple more slides, so I'll have plenty of time for questions here. The last part of this is trying to understand, okay, so did what you sample actually represent the number of species that you would need to collect in order to represent the diet that you're trying to, to document. And so we can do these, they call these sample size based refraction or rarefaction extrapolation curves. And basically it's a way to look at species richness and species diversity. So we've got these two different lines, and by and large, for what you're looking for is you're looking to see both of these lines sort of asymptote. And if they asymptote, that's giving you a general idea that you can feel pretty confident you've sampled at an adequate level to basically represent the diet. Now, again, this is not breaking it up by individual sampling sites. It's not breaking it up by gear types or anything. This is just putting all the big eye tunas together and all the yellowfin tunas together. And when we look at these curves, of course, the yellowfin tuna gives us a little bit more confidence than the big eye tuna does, but we feel very confident that what we've sampled, at least as it relates to these 2 years, definitely captures the diet. We feel very confident about that. We did this for the billfishes, and we did it for albacore. Not surprising, the curves look like this, right? We only sampled 35, 44, and 17 or something. I'm trying to remember the numbers, but they were very low. They were very low. So it's not surprising that these curves still sort of look like they're going up, if you will, meaning that you would need to sample more individuals, if you wanted to be 100% sure that you were totally capturing the diet, you could sample some more individuals. But I'll get to the caveat of that when I go to the conclusions, which is here. So just to kind of bring this all together, let's go back to the original objective of the project, and that was to identify the importance of chub mackerel, primarily in the diet of marlins. But as I said, we leveraged some of the other sampling that we were doing to bring in some of these other top predators in the offshore environment, namely yellowfin and big eye. And we only found 2 positive identifications of chub mackerel in yellowfin tuna stomachs, and we found 8 individuals in 2 white marlin stomachs. 1 stomach was from 2018 and 1 stomach was from 2019. And so, overall, if you look at it, the thousands of individual prey species that we collected from these stomachs, chub mackerel account for an exceptionally small component of these marlin diets, exceptionally small component, certainly less than 1%. With regards to our sampling and how well we perceive to have sampled these individuals, the rarefaction curves suggest that increased sampling to fully evaluate the marlin diets might be applicable. But I would put the caveat on here that I think for what was available to us, we captured the diet quite well. And I'd also add that you have to remember, if you go back to slide number 2, we're in a situation where we're very limited in terms of what we can get for marlins in a given year. And I will give you a perfect example. This year, when we went to the mid-Atlantic, the minimum size was bumped up. We only had, over the course of 5 days, I think we only had 1 white marlin that made measure, or that actually was brought in and made measure. So you can see how, some subtle differences in the way the tournaments are run or federal guidelines and things like that would make it really difficult to try to evaluate this on a larger scale. It would just, I don't think you could ever get there, to be honest with you. And I think what we provided here is a good representation of what that diet is. Tuna diet, we feel is adequately sampled, at least for the 2 years that we did. And again, prey consumption, we see some differences between these animals, but we also see a lot of similarities. The scombrids are certainly dominant, especially a lot of the bullet tunas. And the omstrepid squids are certainly a large component, primarily the short fin squids, which is not surprising in the offshore environment. Again, some slight interannual differences, not unexpected, given variability in population cycles and ocean conditions. And also remember that these animals are all separating vertically. The marlins tend to be more of an epipelagic, so do the yellowfins, whereas the big eyes are going to be exploiting, epipelagic and mesopelagic layers as well. So I think I've gone for 45 minutes. Hopefully that wasn't too long. I thought we had an hour, and I'm happy to, tried to get through a lot for all of you. I wanted to provide you with as much as we could. But I'm happy to take some questions, and I'm also available via that email and that phone if you have any questions. So again, thank you to the council for giving us the opportunity to do this project, and we will be submitting that final report for you and all of our data very soon. So thank you.
Yeah, Walt, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative. something that the council has certainly been looking forward to receiving this information so we can help better understand those the diets of these species and the fisheries that we manage. So thank you again for your presentation. I do have a couple hands that
Yep.
have gone up.
Sure.
And we have plenty of time, and we have 15 minutes here. So
Okay,
let's
great.
see what kind of questions we have. I'm going to go first to Skip Feller. Go ahead, Skip.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was actually very, very interesting, what you found there. And I really just two quick questions.
Sure.
Why did you not go to the Big Rock down in Moorhead, knowing the vast, kill blue marlin tournament there? And then also, did you get to sample the big blue marlin in Ocean City this year?
So we didn't actually budget in that we would go to the Big Rock, and we also didn't expect that one year where the Big Rock landed a ton of blue marlin. I will say there's a caveat to that though. Jeff Buckle, who is somewhat of a colleague of mine, shared a lot of his diets information with us. He samples that tournament. We didn't see their presence there either. So that's not included in this dietary analysis per se, but I did ask him for the data just to kind of mine it, just to see if we would find any of those chub mackerels in there. So that's the first part. It's kind of a budget issue, and then the fact that we were able to get some of that data on the side, if you will, or in collaboration with someone. And then second was that in regard to the 1,152 pound marlin?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is in a freezer in Ocean City awaiting me. I was in Cape May at the time, and I couldn't get across. I couldn't get over. I was over there on the ferry, and I couldn't get back over there to get it before I had to go home. But Brian's going to save it for me. It's in the freezer. It's all bagged up, and we're going to go down and get it here probably in the next few weeks.
Gotcha. Thank you. And that actually was very interesting presentation.
Great. Super. Thank you so much. Appreciate the questions too.
All right. Thanks, Skip, for the question. Next, Dewey Himmelwright, you're up.
Thank you, and Walt, thank you for the presentation. Really interesting. Particular to the sampling of the marlin tournaments. The marlins that you're sampling are only the ones that are accepted to the weigh-in at the tournaments, correct? If the fish did not qualify and went back on the boat, it did not get sampled. Is that correct?
That's correct. We do not touch a single fish, take a single scale, or anything from any fish that is not a federally approved marlin. That's correct. We don't touch them.
Wait a second. Federally approved or met the minimal tournament size?
I'm sorry, dude. I should have qualified that. But both. So if the tournament subscribes to the federal minimum only, if it does not meet that, we do not touch it. If it is a fish, for example, this year we had one that didn't meet the tournament minimum. I asked the captain if it was okay to collect the stomach, and I was given permission to collect the stomach. But that instance did not happen in the 3 years of the diet study. So 18, 19, and 20, we didn't have that happen. We did have that happen this year with one boat in Cape May, where the fish was a federally legally landed marlin, but it was not of the tournament minimum size. And so it went back on the boat, but before it did, I requested permission, and I did get that stomach. Does that clarify it?
Yeah, and one more question.
Sure.
Is there a temperature taken of the fish that are sampled? Is that taken to see what the temperature of the fish is when it's arrival at the dock for sampling, or is that not part of?
So I can't speak to the White Marlin Open, and I can't speak to the Cape May component of the Mid-Atlantic. I can only tell you what happens where I am, and that's in Cape May. And in Cape May, we do not, or nor do I know of anybody who takes the temperature of any of the fish when they come off the boat, including the tunas.
Yeah, I was just curious to your work, because I know the tournaments operate in a certain different venue. But I was just curious if you do that with your work when you're sampling.
When we generally don't take the temp, like for example, if back home, now we have a big foraging component to our bluefin work. Those fish have their temperatures taken, but that's a little different because they go to commercial dealers. One thing that it would be great to do, but I know you can't do in this context, is from a diet analysis point of view, we want to retard degradation as much as possible. And technically, if you wanted to do that, you would remove it and ice it, but you can't do that in this situation. You can't remove the stomach. You're losing fluids and you're losing weight, and of course that that jeopardizes the fish and potentially the tournament rules and things like that. So we don't take the temperatures for these. The only temperatures that we would take is up home in Maine if we're doing the bluefin studies, or we're doing the studies for on the pelagic longline. I believe those tunas do have their temperatures taken, but they're also all iced immediately.
You saying that all the marlins are iced?
No. The commercial bluefin that we sample, and if we sample on the pelagic longline, those fish are iced. Those fish are cleaned and iced. That's what I'm saying.
And one follow-up question, I might have missed it in your presentation. Do you have a total number of samples that you did for the marlins or all species that you took samples from?
For this
project?
Yeah, hang on. Yeah, so hang on one second, Dewey. Let me go back here. So Yellowfin and Big Eye is 758 stomachs that included, or what we call non-empty stomachs, meaning it had something in it. About 300 of the stomachs we sampled didn't have anything in them. And if you missed it, you know this as well as I do. A stress response of being caught on a line is a lot of times these fish regurgitate. They throw up what's in their stomach. That's just a stress response. Same thing with the marlins. So that's the tunas, 758 non-empty stomachs. And then if we go to the marlins here, it looks like 17 blue marlins, 36 white marlins, and 44 round scales. So was that around 100 marlins?
Yep. All right, appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. Very in depth.
Not a problem, Dewey. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dewey. Thanks for your answers, Walt.
Yep.
Kate Wilkie, you're next.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for the detailed presentation. That was really understandable the way you explained it. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how. So I'm assuming that what prey is found in the stomach is reflective of what's available in the water at that time. So does your report touch on that at all? And I apologize, I haven't been able to read the report yet.
No,
I just wondered if you had any comment about that.
We're still putting it together. As I mentioned to Julie, we like, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, maybe 2.5, 3 weeks ago now, we just got the last trailing bits of the genetic data. So we're still putting it together. So there are some differing views on whether or not, fish predators are generalists in the sense that they'll take in proportion to what's available in the water column at the time or available to them. So for example, in 1 year, if Almostrephids are more abundant, then probability states that you're going to find them in higher proportions. And then there's other papers to suggest that some of these animals are actually being quite selective. And, I would actually feel comfortable using Atlantic bluefin up my way as an example. For decades, Atlantic herring has dominated their diet to the extent that in some cases it's as high as 70 or 80% of the mean weight of the stomach is just herring. Now, the herring stocks for quite some time were considered to have rebounded and their abundance was high too. But now we're sort of in a different position with bluefin and herring. The herring stocks are considered to be down, and yet we still see that bluefin are trying to find those herring, and they're about 30% of the diet. So I think to some extent, the question you're asking me depends on the species, but I also think too that what's in front of them and what's available, they're going to go after so long as they can swallow it. There might be some preferences with regard to some of the tunas, maybe small pelagics, what we call high energy or lipid rich pelagics for sure. But I think abundance has a lot to do with it, and availability has a lot to do with it. You know, we see that on a regional scale just in the Gulf of Maine. You know, if they find the sand lance, they're on the sand lance for a while, and then they leave and they exploit that pocket, and then they find some herring or they find some squid. So, but that will probably be touched on a little bit in the report, just to say that, you know, diet probably for these individuals is based on an availability to where they are. And you actually, you know, as I mentioned, you'll see that vertical niche partitioning with the tunas, right, between the yellowfins and the big eyes. It's actually kind of nice. You see that difference, and that's just based on where they're, you know, where they're spending their time and what's available to them.
Yeah, thank you for that information. And I found it really interesting too, how you reported on what was available based on the genetic analysis of the stomach contents, and just wondering how diet studies in the past might have had some different findings if the genetics were available at that time. So but yeah, really interesting report. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, Kate. And with regards to the older studies, it kind of depends on the species. You know, we have a really hard time with bluefin because they're warm-bodied, right? You got a warm-blooded fish, it's got a warm stomach, turnover times are really quick. And so, you know, in those cases, you know, the genetic barcoding can be very valuable. At least the hard part analysis, if nothing else, can be very valuable. But for other species, it's very slow. So with regards to your question, it probably would depend largely on what animals those researchers were working with and sort of their physiology, you know, how quickly the turnover is. But the genetic barcoding is really cool. But I with the caveat, you do have to do your due diligence, because a lot of times you can come back with things that just don't make sense. But it's a powerful tool.
Okay, thanks for that.
Sure.
Skip, your hand's up still. Did you have another question before we go ahead and conclude?
I'm sorry, I did not.
Okay. Anyone else from the council have any questions for Walt?
And again, feel free to email me or feel free to call me as well and ask me any questions. I'm happy, and as I told Julia, we'll share all of this with you. You supported the project, and we're happy to give you everything, pictures included. So,
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
maybe, you know, I think after the report comes out, you might get some calls from people who have questions related to the report. I am going to ask the public if there's anybody from the public that wants to offer anything or have any questions for Walt on the presentation before we go ahead and conclude here.
Yep, not a problem.
I don't see any hands popping up from the public. So again, Dr. Gillette, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative. We look forward to the final report, and I'm glad we were able to juggle some things around on our end to accommodate your schedule. It was well worth it, and thanks again for being here with us today.
No problem. Thank you. And I do appreciate you accommodating the schedule. I appreciate it. I'm really sorry. I just had a personal
Yeah,
thing.
no worries.
Okay. All right. I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much. Good luck with the rest of the meeting, everybody. Take care.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Okay, everybody. I think it's probably best if we just go ahead and jump right into the last item on our agenda today. We have an hour for the Atlantic mackerel rebuilding discussion. And I'm going to turn it, I think Jason has a few slides to provide a little background. And then Dr. Paul Rago is going to discuss with us the SSC's thoughts on rebuilding. And then we'll get into some questions that staff have put together that the council is going to need to provide some feedback and some thoughts on, possibly in the form of a motion or just reaching consensus based on the presentations that we receive and where the council wants to go. So with that said, I'm going to step away for about a minute and a half, and I'll be right back, but I'm going to turn it over to Jason to go ahead and get his presentation started. Go ahead, Jason.
Thanks. Can you confirm my audio and my presentation is up?
Yeah, I can see it, and you sound great.
Thank you. Okay, so going to review some different updates on the kind of version 2 of mackerel rebuilding. I'm going to provide a little background, then we'll turn to Dr. Rago, and then some potential recommendations and decision points that more or less following along with the memo that was in the briefing book. So quick update, last council meeting, the council made emergency action requests to GARFO to change the ABCs to about 15,500 metric tons for 2021 and 2022 while rebuilding is being reconsidered. So NIMS is proceeding with that. They have a lot of discretion in what they end up doing and whether they do anything or what they do. My sense is they might look at an in-season adjustment for 2021 and then maybe an emergency action to cover all of 2022. So there's no gaps. But they're kind of working on that internally, and we haven't had any, official proposed rules or emergency rules or interim rules come out. But their work on that has certainly been kind of facilitating, allowing us to kind of focus on this rebuilding 2.0. And we've had low landings so far since that request of mackerel. Wouldn't expect landings if they occur in the fall to occur for a bit from now. So the council has provided some previous direction at based on advice of the SSC and staff. You indicated to kind of focus on a range of rebuilding probabilities in 10 years. Discussion with NIM staff has indicated that January 1, 2023 would be a feasible implementation date, and that would have a rebuilding target date of June 1, 2032. It's technically like 9.5 years, but it meets the 10-year and 10.5 doesn't. So this is when things would commence, and the population is estimated as the SSB spawning stock biomass is estimated as of June 1 each year. So you also indicated to include, what would a standard council risk policy, the P-star calculation, result in, based on the Fs that come out of the first years of those and some of the rebuilding calculations that Kirsten Curdy at the Science Center, she's done a lot of work for this. Looks like that would probably rebuild in less than 10 years. You also had previously indicated to use the emergency action number as an assumed 2021 catch for projection. Revisit that in a little bit, and requested some additional input about what would be the best way to deal with recruitment through the rebuilding process. And so I'll turn to Dr. Rago for a summary of the SSC's thoughts on this, and I can advance the slides as you like, Dr. Rago.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jason. Appreciate it. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, thanks. I want to give a little bit of background on where we are in terms of the work of the SSC. About 50% of the report that you received under tab 8 is devoted to Atlantic mackerel, and I think equally or a fairly large fraction was also devoted to it in our July meeting. So this is an ongoing process. Also wanted to just highlight the work that Jason has done in terms of the background work and organizing and everything else that ensures that this product is useful to the council. He's already mentioned Kirsten Curdy's work at the center and her unfailing ability to provide information to us. And then finally, Dave Secor, who is the lead on this within the SSC, provided a lot of detail. So we began this process in July in detail. We asked for guidance. The guidance came through specification of a rebuilding time of 10 years, focus on what it would look like under success probabilities of 50, 60, and 75%. And then finally, to use the P-star method as a potential method for rebuilding. P-star, of course, is a generic risk aversion kind of policy. It's not designed for rebuilding per se, because there's no time element associated with it, but it is a potential strategy for rebuilding. Now, the dilemma underlying rebuilding is essentially related to assumptions related to recruitment. Since 2009, recruitments have been below the median of the long-term time series, except with one exception, the 2015. But we really don't know what the reasons are. You know, is it low stock size providing low numbers of recruits, or is it poor environmental conditions that are offsetting that, or is it a combination of both factors? So if it's current low levels of recruitment and they continue to persist, then you'll have you know, lower catches and a longer rebuilding period. If recruitment is due to low stock size, then if you reduce the F, you're going to increase the stock size, and you can, in theory, accelerate population growth over time. And we'll give some highlights of what that might mean. And then the final one is if low recruitment is just really a string of bad luck, then the stock may recover more quickly. That is, that those long-term high recruitments that have been observed in the past might equally occur in the future. So any trajectory of rebuilding has to be caveated with the fact that it relies on factors that currently cannot be distinguished. Next slide, please. Okay, so the initial conditions are important. And so they all begin with the final model run in terms of the initial population. This constitutes the initial population size for rebuilding. We assumed, as Jason noted, that the catches in 2021 and 22 were 15,512 metric tons. They're combined with the realized or estimated 2020 catches of 18,000 metric tons. The rebuilding policy is assumed to begin in 2023. So just to recapitulate those three hypotheses, one is that, you know, the long-term recruitment is possible. So from 1975 onward is equally possible. So there's no change. The second one is that there's some change that's occurred, probably due to environmental factors, and that means that only those recruitments that we've seen since 2009 and onward are possible in the future. That one's a more pessimistic outcome. And then finally, the third hypothesis is whether or not there's it's due to low stock size, which implies low recruitment and therefore a longer rebuilding. This one has kind of a combination of both factors. So in the next slide, please, we looked at what are the first term of reference that the SSC was asked to address was, you know, what are the best assumptions for recruitment? After long debate and a lot of writing and discussion, the SSC does not find support for the use of unconstrained recruitment estimates drawn from the entire time series. That is, we don't think that simply drawing recruitments from the entire time series of historical recruitments is scientifically justified. There's not enough evidence to support that they're instantaneously going to bounce back to what those historical levels were. That there's probably some level of stock dependency in that process. We recognize that these rebuilding plans are going to be reevaluated every 2 years, at least with respect to the frequency of the management track assessments, and that, you know, forewarning that the council will likely require continuous modifications along the way as conditions merit or warrant. We did offer 2 recruitment options that we feel are scientifically defensible and supported by the data. The first is, you might call a 2-phase approach, in which we looked at the odds of having higher recruitment when the stock is above 1/2 BMSY. So basically, we found that on the order of 8 to 9 times the odds ratio, the odds of having larger recruitment when in fact the stock was above 1/2 BMSY was about 9 times higher than it was when it was below. That was considered reasonably strong evidence for a stock dependency. And this method has been used in the literature, at least for some instances. And then the second one was the sort of a slower, more pessimistic outlook, was that, well, if those environmental conditions that led to the low, or may have led to the low recruitment since 2009 continue, we expect to see a continuation of that, and therefore you would have a slower rebuilding, lower catches along the way. So yeah, there are some benefits of each of these hypotheses, both in terms of favorable outcomes for the fishery that depends on them, the other resources in the ocean that depend on them as well, for forage and so forth. There are just a number of pluses and minuses associated with those, and I won't belabor them too much, just in the interest of moving things along. We can come back to them after the discussion, but there are some somewhat sensitive issues associated with making these particular choices. But in aggregate, the SSC felt that these were appropriately they were justified by a review of the available evidence and would constitute an important and valuable way for moving forward with the rebuilding strategy. So the second term of reference, next slide please, was essentially what is an appropriate OFL CV? How uncertain are we about that OFL that's estimated from the model? And how does it interact with the recruitment assumption? Particularly that when you evaluate under a standard P-star risk policy. So after about 8 pages of discussion and examination of multiple factors, and those are listed in detail in attachment 4 of the SSC report. This is the derivation of the appropriate level of CV coefficient of variation for the OFL process. So this is currently at the highest level that the SSC uses for evaluating ABC determinations. Now, there are a number of factors associated with that. One, of course, is that we really don't have a very good understanding of the underlying natural mortality of this resource. There is evidence from catch curve analyses that are apart from the model itself that suggest that natural mortality could be very high, along with very high fishing mortality. There's some evidence within the model itself that there's misspecification of natural mortality, suggesting that a slightly higher rate, maybe about 25% higher natural mortality, might be more consistent with the modeling process. There's a high likelihood of some unknown set of ecosystem factors that are jointly affecting the recruitment process, that is the translation from egg to 1-year-old fish, the growth processes that lead to, and maturation that lead to spawning stock biomass, the influence of fishing mortality, and then the joint effects of all those in terms of projections and how they might go. And then, as with most species, I think we'll soon probably, another 100 years or so, we'll be saying, as with all species, there's a strong or a high degree of uncertainty between stock size and recruitment. Notwithstanding this sort of high level of CV associated with it, we noted that it's not a function of the assessment model or most of the data inputs that go into that model. It's a very strong confidence in the assessment model itself, but simply reflecting the reality that nature hasn't dealt us a good hand in this case. So let's talk about some of those sources of uncertainty. That's term of reference 3. So this time period for recruitment stanzas, whether we look at the entire period from 75 onward or whether we look at 2009 onward, is a big source of uncertainty. We weren't able to sort of postulate a sequence in which you went from the low recruitment stanza to the high recruitment stanza. Our crystal balls were all broken and foggy, so there was no way of making that type of forecast. We did note that the translation of egg survey results to spawning stock biomass has a lot of different steps in it, and some of those can be assumption laden. So it was important that that process is highlighted, notwithstanding its overall utility to the and to the coherency of the results. It is one that, as you'll see later, we do recommend some additional examination. The spatial distribution of Atlantic mackerel has been changing, adults, and so that's an important source of scientific uncertainty. The trawl survey itself is not particularly good for catching the older animals. They do tend to be faster and can have potentially lower catchabilities. It was assumed that we have a fixed natural mortality not only across years but also across ages, and that also may be slightly a tenuous assumption. Certainly things like Dr. Gallette's diet study can provide some insight into potentially size dependency of some of these mortality rates. Recreational landings and discards within the U.S. are not known very well. Landings have gone up, I believe, to about 37% of the total removals in recent years. But one of the biggest ones that may be sort of underlying some of the problems within the assessment itself are the Canadian bait and recreational fisheries. This is not the SSC's word. This is reports from DFO Canada, and they estimated there may be on the order of 2,000 to 5,000 metric tons. So there was the term of reference for the next slide asked us, what ecosystems factors are and should be considered for rebuilding. Now the SSC, the SAW 64, which was the most recent benchmark study, did not explicitly account for predation mortality. Overall, there's low incidence in the diets of fish that are sampled by the NEFSC bottom trawl survey. That is, for species that are caught in there, there's a very long and impressive time series of stomach contents taken for those species. However, within that, there aren't a lot of incidences of Atlantic mackerel in those stomachs. So that was not sufficient to sort of explain the predation mortality. The composite predation by many of the highly migratory species, sharks, as well as marine mammals and birds, are unknown, and efforts to reconstruct a history of those are exceedingly difficult. So it's not likely that there'll be an ability to do that anytime soon, simply other than to to note that they could be high and certainly must be high in some years, whether they're generalist or specialist feeders out there. The SAW 64 also considered habitat changes, changes in availability, and changes to the fishery itself. And all of these factors helped inform the model identification process. So those will likely continue in the future and so forth. And then finally, the ecosystem criterion or criteria were considered extensively in the OFL-CV determination. And again, I would just draw your attention to attachment 4 for further details on that. So finally, the term of reference 5 consisted of a set of research recommendations that the SSC provided. First, they supported all the recommendations that were previously identified at SAW 64. We strongly emphasized the continuation of the U.S. component of the Atlantic Mackerel Egg Survey and continued collaboration with the fishing industry and Canadian scientists. This process works because the assessment process is fully engaged with both components there to improve our understanding of this stock that spans 2 countries. There was, a kind of a general agreement that further exploration of both time and age variant M and so-called M2, which is the predation mortality, that is mortality that's attributable to consumption by other predators as opposed to ones that may simply be associated with other factors other than predation. I mentioned earlier this conversion between egg density and spawning stock biomass involves a series of assumptions, ranging from individual animal fecundity to its size structure to this rescaling of biomass and the duration of the eggs in the water column and many other factors. So getting a better handle on that error associated with that will be useful for, certainly for helping to distinguish between what is signal versus noise. And then finally, there was some additional requests for evaluating recreational fishing data and its influence or assessment on the assessment itself. So with that, that's all I have, and I appreciate the opportunity to present. And if there are questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Thank you.
And
All right, thanks,
Mike,
Paul.
Jason, I was just suggest it might make sense to take a brief pause if folks have questions on Paul's stuff before we dive forward.
Sure, that's what I was going to suggest. Okay, does anyone have any questions on the SSC's report? Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I fully admit this is an absolutely ignorant question, but Dr. Rigo, have just given the uncertainties associated with the missing catch that DFO has noted, are there efforts underway by Canadian scientists to try to account for that? And, the next assessment that they do that, might provide some benefit to our assessment here?
I'm not aware of any directed efforts to identify or estimate the magnitude or to hypothesize how it might have been in the past. I would have to rely on follow up with Kirsten to see you know, if there are, it would surprise me if there were not, but I can't comment directly on that factor.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's see if anybody else from the council has any questions for Paul.
Kirsten may be able to chime in on that. They may do something with some of that catch, and if Kirsten has audio, she might be able to pop in.
Kirsten, are you able to?
I'm here. I'm not sure you can hear me though.
We can.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh,
yep.
excellent. Okay. Hi, everyone. So, if I'm remembering correctly, they have looking forward into the future. I think DFO is taking measures in order to better monitor the unreported components. Sorry for the beeping in the background. But I think in particular the recreational fishery. I'm fairly positive there are measures there. Looking back, it's pretty difficult to estimate. And DFO has done some work surveying industry and talking to them to kind of get some ballparks, and in their modeling platform, they actually estimate the amount that was not reported. So they do that as part of their assessment model when they look back in time. So looking back, they kind of do it through modeling and through some kind of surveying that they had done with the fishery. Looking forward, it's high on their priority list. I shouldn't say that because that's my opinion, but it seems to be. It's definitely on their radar because they had done an MSC that had shown that, you know, between the unreported catches that they have, and in between the fact that the stock is in U.S. waters and getting fished in our fishery, that they don't have a lot of control over removals. And so I think they're really, I would not be surprised that they're taking steps to kind of get that under more control. So hopefully that answers that question.
Michelle, does that help you out?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Thank
yeah.
you so much, Kirsten.
Right.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks,
No,
Kirsten.
no problem. No problem.
Anyone else from the council? I'll ask one last time before I go off to the public. All right, seeing no hands from the council at this time, let's go to the public for questions of Dr. Rago. Jeff Kalin. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Members of the council. Hi, Paul. I'd like to go back to the earlier slide, if possible, with term of reference 4, and the bullet about SAW 64 not explicitly accounting for predation mortality, and then the slide that was just up. I do support the research priority in terms of reference 5 relative to evaluating time and age variant M and M2, but didn't SAW 64 estimate an M value? And if so, what was it? I'm glad Kirsten is on too. So there wasn't a value that was created somewhere like 0.2 or 0.3.
Yeah, I think Kirsten is probably your best bet for the actual estimate on
Right.
that. Yeah,
But there is an estimate, and that represents a certain amount of SSB that would be, the assessment sets aside, for predation, even though we don't have as accurate estimates as we would all like. So is that true, Kirsten? Is there a M2 or M set aside?
We looked at kind of the empirical estimates using life history attributes, so using kind of like the growth coefficient and the maximum age and those kind of life history attributes of the species, and that gave us an M of about 0.2, which is what we assumed in the model. So we assumed time, age, and variant. When we did the modeling, we looked at the results, and in particular, it's called a likelihood profile. And we looked at it and said, okay, what number for M would give us the best possible fit. And I think that value for the last assessment was 0.2. But again, that is, that was based on fit to the data and in the modeling framework, and it wasn't based on, none of that was based on information on kind of consumption of mackerel from either piscivores or highly migratory species, marine mammals, and it did not vary over time.
Yeah, thanks. So, an M estimate of 0.2 to 0.28. 0.2 has been a kind of a standard M estimate in, most assessments, up until recent years when forage became more of a concern. But my point is, and I did bring this up at the SSC meeting, Paul, you may remember this, but, there's a value there that represents thousands or hundreds of thousands of metric tons that basically are set aside for predation, ocean predation to the extent that we understand it, before the ABC process begins, I believe. And, to me, building on the TOR5 on this, it would be interesting, I think, for the public to kind of have a comparison between the yields that, the ABCs or the ACLs, represent relative to percentage of SSB against these, best available estimates of natural mortality, which is 0.2 to 0.28. And I would imagine that the F value is quite a bit lower than that. And to me, that's been a missing calculation for a long time. So, do you think that this idea has any validity at all? I guess that I'm supposed to be asking a question, and that's really my question. And I appreciate any response, because it's something that, I want to avoid double dipping for forage, basically. We've talked about that for a long time. And I just want to point out that I think there is a set aside. And I think I'm right. But anyway, thanks for letting me ask the question, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think you characterize it appropriately. One is that the M estimate does reflect a component that is offered up to Mother Nature there for her purposes, and therefore represents forage for other species. The relationship between what is available, or what fraction of the biomass goes to natural to back to nature versus that which is accrued to the fishery, is basically proportional to the ratio of the fishing mortality versus the natural mortality. Because of selectivity, I don't want to get too many details into this, but that computation can be done, and you could show that there's fairly high fraction in some years that reflects a larger fraction to the nature versus the fishery. In instances where when the fishing mortality is very high, that computation will in fact give you the balance shifting towards removals by humans. So it's not a simple one-to-one based on the fishing mortalities reported in the various components, but suffice it to say that it's not always the case that the transfer of biomass to back to the ecosystem is less than that which goes, or greater than, excuse me, that which goes to the fishery. So it could work with Kirsten, or she can probably have it done before we're done with this conversation.
No doubt. No, I appreciate that. It's a difficult question. We've talked about it in the past, but I think those comparisons are useful, particularly when you have a low F rate projected to deal with an environmental perturbation, from the environment. So
Right, right.
Anyway,
And
yeah,
certainly.
thanks a lot. We don't need to take any more time. I think
Oh.
I should talk to you and Kirsten offline, but I think to the council though, it's an interesting computation that could be done without a whole lot, without a big heavy lift. And I think it would let the public know that in fact, you know, predation mortality is considered in all these assessments. And I appreciate the time, and I'll just leave it right there. Thanks again, Paul and Kirsten.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for your questions, Jeff. Anyone else from the audience, public, have anything they'd like to add to the discussion? Any comments or questions regarding Paul's presentation? Excuse me. Okay, seeing none. Thanks again for your presentation, Paul. Jason, I think we could probably conclude with, we probably have a few slides here at the end, and then we'll look to see what kind of action the council wants to take based on staff recommendations. So whenever you're ready, Jason.
Okay, thank you. We're back to a blue screen.
Yes.
Great. So a few things for council consideration. One thing is, you know, Paul mentioned the projections as currently run were about using that emergency action request. We kind of purposefully didn't ask Kirsten to rerun everything just yet, to kind of conserve her time. With the existing projections she's run a lot. We could, you know, some we had, others I felt pretty comfortable ballparking. So we didn't make the request to rerun everything just yet until we narrow things down a bit. If the council does narrow things down a bit, that reduces the workload to rerun some things. And so one suggestion was, you know, as we go into 2022, probably a March SSC meeting, then, you know, and getting the final values signed off on by the SSC, you know, we'll be able to estimate 2021 catch fairly well. We may have a good amount of information about likely 2022 catch also. So staff is suggesting that, you know, the council, you know, consider signing off on using whatever that latest info is when we do the next/last set of projections. And, you know, if catches are lower, then biomass bumps up a little bit, you know, catches bump up a little bit, et cetera. And I don't expect catch to be higher than what we've set aside so far. And then basically trimming to 4 options plus status quo. I think there may be one sentence in the briefing document where it says like 2 out of 5, it should have been 2 out of 4. The 5th is kind of like the status quo, which isn't as relevant here. But the 4 options that were presented in the brief materials are really kind of based on a combination of the SSC input, the resulting projections or similar projections that Kirsten's already done, and some staff-to-staff discussions. With Garfo. Garfo has been another kind of step-in-step partner of trying to figure out how to move forward with mackerel. And kind of preliminary discussions with Garfo staff indicate that these 4 options cover a reasonable range. Talking to Kirsten, a few things about these that she just suggested I re-highlight is that we have one that just assumes the low recruitment. The others assume a bump up. Remember Paul's two options there that Paul described. But with 2, 3, and 4, if you don't get that higher recruitment, i.e. kind of a return to typical, the recruitment time series since 1975 to current, SSB will not rebuild as projected. And I mean, it's kind of the case for all rebuilding plans. You're assuming some recruitment. If you don't get it, you're not going to rebuild as fast. If you get more, you rebuild faster. Kirsten, kind of thought it was good to highlight that the projected biomass run that we did a few years ago didn't materialize as thought, and we actually thought we were higher than we were at that point. So these are 10-year approaches, except for the standard P-star, because Paul mentioned the P-star doesn't have a time it's more of a risk approach. And so those 4 rebuilding options are, one, assume that persistent lower recruitment, and the stock is projected to rebuild in 10 years if you basically have minimal catch for all 10 years. And that's not probably practicable. It may not be legal or approvable, since we know we're going to get catch from rec from Canada. But I think it's staff thinks it's useful to keep in there because it just highlights the impact if we keep getting poor recruitment. And the projection, the reference points that we're trying to rebuild to are based on higher recruitment. If we keep getting low recruitment, it'll be very difficult to get there. And then once we get there, it wouldn't have the productivity that we'd think it'd have and come in a typical rebuilding scenario. But I think it's, again, so it's kind of an odd duck, but may not be approvable, since we kind of know those catch streams aren't going to happen. But it highlights the challenge we're facing there if we continue to get low recruitment kind of indefinitely. Number 2 is, just applying the standard P-star risk policy, taking into account the biomass, taking into account the stock size relative, the biomass relative to the reference point. Ballparking it, it's probably about a 6 to 8 year rebuilding plan. 50th percentile, so it's like, you've got a kind of a coin flip, a 50% probability of rebuilding in 6 to 8 years roughly. Catches are going to start around 4,000 metric tons coast-wide in 2023. That's still, Canada alone is at 4,000 right now. My sense is they're not an assessment year, so I don't see a ton of inertia. There'd probably be pressures to go lower and higher with no assessment. I think, Canada may well be at 4,000 for 2022. Who knows about 2023, and then the rec catch. So number 3 is a 60% chance of rebuilding. Catches start around 7,000 metric tons. Again, that's coast wide. So deducting in terms of the U.S. commercial fishery, have to deduct probably 4,000 for Canada, 2,000 or 3,000 for rec probably. We'll look at a couple different ways to consider that once things kind of get narrowed down a little bit. But again, so for a commercial fishery starting very, very low, if any, even with number 3. And then with number 4 is kind of the standard Magnuson 50% chance for rebuilding 10 years. Coast-wide catches would start around 8,600 metric tons. Again, that's just a couple thousand for the commercial quota after everything else is addressed, Canada and rec to start. And then for number 1, the catches stay very low for the whole time series. It might be 500 metric tons to 1,500 metric tons over the course of the 10 years because you're not getting in good recruitment. For 2, 3, and 4, catches again start at as are on the screen, and then as biomass starts increasing, they increase as well. One thing I think it's important to highlight is that even in the better recruitment, i.e. the typical recruitment scenario, with the lower reference points from the stock assessment, just applying the standard P-star risk policy to a fully rebuilt stock, you're still, I think, below 30,000 metric tons total ABC for even a rebuilt stock, given the current assessment. So there's some other options discussed. A 75th percentile probability, and from staff's perspective, all the additional options kind of seem either illegal, unfeasible, or redundant, and can probably be moved to considered but rejected. We've got more or less a range from 0 to the maximum possible that Magnuson would allow. And then once that range is set, staff work with the monitoring committee to kind of fill out some of the management measures for each of those 4 scenarios. Closure mechanisms, trip limits, the council requested including a mesh requirement to mirror the mackerel the butterfish mesh requirement. Addressing the river herring and shad caps, council already said consider both the standard scaling approach the council's used in the past, along with a floor of where we are right now, and some recreational measures. Kind of limited on rec measures. A lot of the catches in state waters, not going to have necessarily a lot of direct control, but can consider potential an EEZ closure or seasonal EEZ closures. There was some discussion of a size limit, and staff is recommending, based on the discussions with Chub mackerel and just various issues with enforcing size limit there, also questionable release mortality, that be also moved to consider but rejected. Staff recommended the council reach out to the states with substantial mackerel harvest, really Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, with kind of, a lot of the mackerel harvest is in state waters. So a request for them to consider 50% reduction, some, design their own measures to try to achieve that, given the what we're looking at kind of for the fisheries that do operate in federal waters. And then gotten some input that, a fair bit of the mackerel harvest that occurs even in state waters maybe either used as bait in state waters for striped bass or taken offshore in federal waters for HMS bait. If that's the case, then the council's measures are prohibition on on retention, possession or retention. Then there's some indirect impacts on those fish that are caught in state waters and brought out to federal waters. So staff also recommends some HMS outreach. Just some of that has already occurred, but just to make sure those folks are in the loop. So kind of looking for council guidance today on several things. This is kind of summarize. Is the council okay with those 4 rebuilding options? Is the council okay with making a best estimate for 2021 and a best guess for 2022 once we kind of run the projections and 4 or 3 or 6, whatever scenarios council settles on? Those management measures seem okay, or anything else kind of popped into folks' mind? Did the council would the council be okay with moving size limit question to consider but rejected, that state request, the HMS outreach, and then staff would plan to have probably a number of committee and AP meetings kind of through the winter, leading into targeted council final action in April. Another, we posted the river herring shad update. I'll do a quick summary of that after, but I'll pause now on the mackerel issue. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jason. So there's a lot there as far as staff recommendations, and I've been asked by staff to make sure that we get the necessary feedback today, so that Jason can work with the FMAT to further develop the different alternatives that were presented. Does anyone have anything they'd like to offer, whether it's a question or a comment regarding what Jason presented as a staff recommendation? Whether you support or oppose certain elements of the staff recommendation, all of it would be, the door is open right now for any thoughts, comments, questions by members of the council. Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and huge thanks to Jason and Kirsten and to Dr. Rago as well. And so I guess just to call maybe a couple questions first. So just confirming that, options 3 and 4 as laid out, in the briefing materials, that's basically a constant F rebuild, correct?
Yes, they would be.
And okay, and so, I know that further down, the briefing memo, talks about taking a P-star-like deduction from, a rebuilding catch, just like a typical OFL that gets buffered would be, redundant. And I guess I'm just thinking back to, bluefish because the council did select ultimately, a 7-year constant F rebuild. But when, we did specs for bluefish, I think just back in August, when the SSC considered it, they considered that F rebuild as sort of, a new FMSY proxy. So, apply the P-STAR control rule. So I guess I'm just kind of thinking ahead about, how operationally some of these things might work in the future. I'm not in opposition to, any of the options that are presented here. I understand that trying to use a higher probability of rebuilding really just, sticks you in the hole, in the red, so to speak, just like option 1 does. And, that's certainly illustrative of that. So I guess it's really, I'm thinking more about, the F rebuild and how that might be treated when it comes to spec setting down the road. Thanks.
Well, with the kind of multiple probabilities of rebuilding, it kind of seemed like a double buffering there. So that was, I think it's up to the council. If the council, wanted to maintain that, it could. But again, there's, with the different probabilities of rebuilding, kind of as a discrete choice, that choice is being made. And, with the higher ones in there, again, it seems like potential for some double buffering. So it's really up to the council.
And Mr. Chairman, if I might just a follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, so I absolutely understand that. I guess I'm, again, just thinking ahead and thinking to how the SSC treated, a very similar situation under bluefish. And, if we get to the point of, selecting, say it's option 4, is the P-STAR going to end up being applied? Just something for us to think about again. I support the options that you've laid out here. And, appreciate sort of the pickle we're in with, having to account for harvests from the Canadians and other, missing reports of harvests.
Right. If I may, Michelle, Dr. Wall, your recollection is exactly correct. The SSC treated the bluefish rebuilding F as a estimator for an OFL, and therefore it was treated under the standard risk policy associated with bluefish. For this instance, and based on the precedent established earlier, we would be applying an OFL CV to the F rebuild, since that would now constitute a measure of overfishing under the rebuild strategy. So, to Jason's point, it is doubling up on the risk. The plus side on that is that it would probably accelerate the actual rebuilding process, but the penalty in terms of annual catch limits could be high. So thank you.
And Paul, I think what Michelle was trying to point out too is that the document lays out that option would be moved to consider but rejected. So the council would say these are the catch streams that the council wants, and that the different probabilities of rebuilding under these options are actually the ABCs that the council wants. And that would be kind of the risk definition the council is using for mackerel rebuilding here. So it would be kind of, the SSC kind of went one way with mackerel and another way with bluefish. So this would kind of make it explicit of what the council was looking for.
Okay, so it's kind of an inversion of the process to some extent. Looking at the realized catches under FRE build as estimators of ABCs. Is that, am I understanding it properly? Well, perhaps a nuance that's not worth pursuing too far, but thank you.
Thank you for the clarification, Jason and Dr. Rago. And it was a question. So I think it's good to have that clarification, at least for me. So I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everyone for that. Joe Semina, you're next.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And thanks to Jason and everyone for the hard work on this. It's a tough spot, and I don't think the group could have been more thorough, and I appreciate Michelle's question as well. So Jason, if you can put back up the questions you have for the council, perhaps I can try and weigh in on some of those. I think I mentioned last time that, I thought looking at what happened in the very early days of blue line tile fish management, or some of the states like Virginia, where I was back before Mid-Atlantic was involved in management, but states that saw a problem in catch, particularly in recreational fisheries, got ahead of Mid-Atlantic management and weighed in to that foray. And I think it's worth asking states to do that here. We're seeing a species that needs all the help it can get. And I think maybe even the same with the HMS outreach may be worthwhile. Regarding size limits, as Jason pointed out, there's concerns on release mortality here. I'm wondering if there's, estimates, Jason, that we could hear about on whether or not we think it's a worthwhile endeavor. And then just to be complete on my end, I would think that using the updated catches is okay. So that's all of them. And then if you had any, release estimates, mortality estimates, I'd be interested in hearing that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any, well, I think the assessment assumes 100% release mortality, but I don't know that that's based on any study particular to Atlantic mackerel. Kirsten, do you have any, can you address that?
We do assume 100% discard mortality for releases, and I'm not aware of estimates that are out there, but I'm always happy to look into it.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Anybody else from the council have any questions regarding this? What I'd like to do after taking another hand or two is step through these 5 bullets and see if we can reach consensus on where we are, so that Jason can continue to work on this. Jason, I got Jason, and then we'll come back to Eric. Go ahead, Jason.
Just Michelle, something you could contemplate maybe, if that kind of, if wanting to preserve the approach it was taken with bluefish is desired by the council, and I think it might most apply to the 50% rebuilding probability in there. So you could just instruct, a 5th option would be the number 4, and then like a 4A would be that, but take the bluefish approach for the additional deduction. So that is just an option to kind of address that. That may address your concern of maintaining that as an option. And that's, again, we're still at a relatively condensed set here. That's it. I just thought of that as I was pondering things there. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Jason. Michelle, something, is this directly to Jason's comment?
Yes, directly to that point. So
Okay,
thank
go
you,
ahead.
Jason. And thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Jason. That's exactly what I was thinking, sort of a 4A or 4B, however you want to term it. But, I'm also sensitive to, the workload for you and Kirsten. If you think it's feasible, I would love for that to be added. Thanks.
Okay, in just a minute or two here, we'll get back to you, Michelle, because we'll have to get that on paper somewhere, maybe in the form of a motion to add it to the rebuilding options. Eric Reed, go ahead, Eric. If you're speaking, Eric, you're on mute.
Okay, that's probably better. It's probably
There
good
you
you
go.
didn't hear me in the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. In your one of your very first slides, Jason, which you don't have to go back to, you did mention in-season adjustment for 2021. Is that the emergency action that is pending?
So the council made the emergency action request. NIMS has a variety of ways to deal with it. You may recall from the last meeting, there was concern if NIMS went with an emergency action right now, it wouldn't last until January 1, 2023. So I think one potential solution is they do an in-season adjustment along the same lines of what the council wanted. And then for January 1, 2022, they would do quote unquote emergency action that could last a year. Then there's no gap. So two separate actions maybe that avoids any gaps. But again, they're still kind of churning through things on their end, but that's my sense of one approach they may take. But they have a lot of flexibility of they can kind of implement any change they deem fit. They have a lot of flexibility once that request has been made. So that's a long answer to a short yes.
Well, no, actually, that was a good answer because there was a possibility that was going to be in place before the end of this year, in which case we would not make it until January the following year. So that was a question of mine. But when we chose emergency action, we had a series of numbers based on 4,000 for Canada, 3,500 for the rec community, and I think that we ended up around, I don't know what it was, 1,700 tons for the commercial fishery. Do we have any indication that those are the same numbers we're going to see when we get that emergency action? That's probably not a question for you, Jason, but maybe somebody else could. I mean, the thing about flexibility, I mean, it doesn't necessarily bother me, but it just depends on how close to the option we saw. Is that what we're going to get? And my next question is, when we go to the SSC in March of 2022, exactly what are we going to have? We're going to have commercial landings data from the U.S. for 2021. What are we going to have for Canadian data? And we're going to be missing some Canadian data. And what are we going to have for our MRIP data before we can actually determine what the commercial catch is going to be at that time?
So, I mean, Canada, they closed part of their fishery, then they reopened, and they've, so I think we'll have a pretty good sense. We'll have most of the MRIP waves, so I think we'll have a pretty good sense of 2021. 2022 will be the trickier thing. I think that Canada, they may try. Well, it just depends on their exact timeline. We'll have to make our best as the monitoring committee would always have to do. Of if we have an emergency action in place, that will provide a good bit of guidance about what we're expecting on the U.S. side. And then we'll have to make an assumption about Canada for 2022 and the other years for that matter. But I mean, unless Canada does anything different, officially. I imagine we'll just keep assuming the 4,000 taken out for Canada would be my preliminary, would be typical of what we've done in the past.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Well, I appreciate those answers. As far as including the 4 options, I'm not opposed to including them. That doesn't mean I like them all. I'm sure you might realize that. But the one thing, we're talking about things in the future, HMS, reaching out to the states. We might as well start thinking about what are we going to do about people who buy mackerel for bait and go offshore and EEZ if it's prohibited. We think we did that under the Forage Fish Amendment, how we handled prohibited species that were bought for bait. We might as well start thinking about it right now because people use mackerel for a lot of different things, including commercial long line, demersal bottom long lines as well. So that's something we should start thinking about how to deal with that when we get the time. So that's it for me. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much for your comments and questions there, Eric. Anyone else from the council at this time? Before I go back to Michelle. Okay, so I think let's go ahead and focus on the rebuilding options at this point. I'd like to maybe focus on not only just the rebuilding options, but the preferred what the preferred use of the updated data for catch projections would be. I think we can probably knock those out. And then we can pause for a second and get through the other questions on Jason's list. So Michelle, you certainly had interest in adding what we would call a 4A under the 50% probability, the constant F strategy. And I'm going to turn to you now. Do you have a motion thought of at this point on how you'd like to phrase that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just say I move that an additional option for A be added that applies a P-star like deduction to option 4.
Perfect. Okay, we have a motion to add an option made by Michelle Duval. Do I have a second? Peter Hughes is seconding that motion. Michelle, did you want to provide any additional thoughts that you haven't already on that?
No, I think, I think my previous rationale stands that this was, an approach that was taken with bluefish. And so if it's not too much work for staff for one more run, then I think it would sort of complete our suite of reasonable options. Thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. Peter, did you want to provide any additional rationale as a seconder?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Michelle. I mean, I would just say that adding an alternative to what we currently have is, in my book, a pretty good thing, just so that we can see what the different runs look like. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. Any council members have any comment on the motion? Does anyone from the public have anything they want to comment on regarding the motion? Okay, seeing no hands, we'll bring it back to the council. Is there any council member who opposes this motion? Any opposition to the motion by members of the council? Seeing no opposition, motion carries by consent. Okay, that's one down. So let's go ahead. The next item that we need to take up has to do with the data, the updated data for catch projections. There was a staff recommendation, the preferred using the updated catch data, using the best estimates for 2021 and 2022 for the projections. This is a staff recommendation. Is there any opposition to moving forward regarding Jason's staff recommendation about the updated catch data? Okay, seeing no hands, Jason will assume that your staff recommendation regarding that subject will move forward as presented. Next, we're going to move into management measures. And there was some question about size limits as part of those management measures. Jason, we didn't spend much time talking about that. Would you be able to go back to that slide that referenced management measures?
Sure. And on the size limit question itself, the recommendation was to move it to considered but rejected, given the mix of complications with chub mackerel and also just questions. Well, on paper, there'd be no benefit maybe, since we're assuming 100% discard mortality. Maybe there might be some actual benefit, but given the apparent high mortality, at least assumed by the assessment, the suggestion was to the staff would, and there is no FMAT for this. I mean, we had an FMAT for the rebuilding action. We're basically relying on the monitoring committee, which has been okay so far. So there'd be typical commercial measures. The rec measures that seem available would be an EE closure, either full year or seasonally. Then there's a size issue. So I think if the council is comfortable with further filling out the others, just really looking for direction on, is the council okay with moving that potential minimum size limit to considered but rejected?
All right, let's stick with that question. Does anyone have any thoughts regarding the size limit management measure being moved to considered but rejected? Anybody have any comments on that? Dan Farnham?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick clarification. So is that 100% mortality rate? Is that pertinent to the recreational fishery also?
That is what's assumed for the recreational fishery in the assessment currently.
Yep. Okay, very good. Thank you for that, Jason.
Okay, Dan. Thank you. Anyone else from the council? Is there any opposition to maintaining the EEZ closure or seasonal closures in the EEZ with the removal of size limits to considered but rejected? Is there any opposition by members of the council in moving forward as staff have recommended? Okay, seeing no hands, we'll go ahead and take that. So Jason, no opposition to removing size limits and putting that in considered but rejected. Okay, down to state requests. So this would be, as Jason mentioned, we would reach out to the states that have the largest landings and can't make them do anything, but we would ask them to consider. Did you say, Jason, it would potentially be a 50% reduction at this time? I mean, is that just a kind of a guess, or did you guys compute that to any degree?
I mean, given the scope of reductions that are apparent to there seem likely for the commercial fishery, the recommendation was to make a request for a 50% reduction, just as kind of a contribution to the process here. That's probably not going to be something that would be assumed for the initial go around in terms of catch projections, but depending on what states actually did, then future projections could potentially utilize that. But so it's a request depending on the outcome. I think then that could affect, 2 years from now when we have a new assessment update and we're making future projections, that could be integrated, but we're not going to know at time of decision making probably what states are going to be doing or, the exact effects of those.
Okay, understood. Does anyone have is there any opposition by members of the council about moving forward with this idea of reaching out to the states to request a reduction? Okay, I don't see any hands, Jason. So as we have with the other parts of your presentation, let's go ahead. We'll say no opposition there. And I think we have what's left. HMS outreach and committee AP meetings. So as far as HMS outreach, is there any opposition to the council working with HMS to get information out regarding the actions here for rebuilding? Okay, seeing none, that's another no opposition. And lastly, as Jason mentioned, there will likely be some committee meetings set up this winter, along with AP meetings to provide guidance as this rebuilding plan gets developed. Is there any opposition? And since Peter will be running those meetings, his vote doesn't count here. So any opposition? All right. Seeing none, Jason, there's no opposition on the last item on your list for council consideration. Is there anything else you said you had something else you wanted to follow up on before we adjourn?
Yeah, a quick update on River Haven Chad, just for the record, staff kind of takes Michelle's motion that it's that the council's okay with the 4 plus that. And in terms, yes, I will stop sharing that and share this. So just, and I think this will have something else on my screen, but are you seeing, does it say River Heron Shad cap update at the top for you?
No, I have Jason Didden is sharing is starting to share content. It's a white screen.
So WebEx is, looks like it's potentially crashing on me. Can you hear me right now?
I can hear you. We can't see anything.
Okay. Then I'm not going to touch anything because I'm afraid it's going to crash. I'll say, okay, so there are some documents posted as supplemental. It just added the Massachusetts indices, several they've provided us in the past, just posted those to the website. So, there's so council can, take a look at that. No kind of immediate action today on River Heron Shad, but as a 2021 deliverable. So since we've had kind of gotten most of the data in, wanted to try to wrap it up. You'll note various 2020 data gaps highlighted. And so you have some of the indices that the states or the center have provided. I want to kind of acknowledge the really good cooperation from the center, and Kirsten was redoing catch estimates for us on this. The states were cranking out indices, so really appreciate that. But note, just keep an eye on the indices and catch estimates. Kind of all end in different years because of data gaps related to COVID in 2020. Like in previous years, some catch estimates are up, some are down, some indices are up, some are down. I think it's kind of overall continued variability within ranges for the most part, a few highs, a few lows, but we discussed earlier that kind of economic spatial analysis will be revisited for the specific months. And some council members may not have been at the time, but that spatial analysis, the idea had been to do it in some winter months where river herring shad catch had been higher. Requested them to do it for the whole year, and I think that'd be necessary, but also the months of already talking to Science Center staff about when they may be able to do that. And then, the whole river herring shad update will be kind of part of what the council revisits as moves into final act.
I don't know if you can hear me, Jason, but we just lost your audio.
Getting ready to say, I think he just crashed.
Yeah, that's probably what happened.
He's no longer in the list.
That may be the first time for him.
I think, Mr. Chairman, he was pretty close to being done, if I understood his list.
Yeah. You want to give him a minute to come back on, do you think, or?
Yeah, we can give him a minute and see if he comes back, and if he doesn't, there's something that he wanted to add, he can do it in the morning when he gets back.
Yeah, that's fine.
Figure all this out.
Sure. Yeah, because he'll be back with us in the morning anyway.
Right.
For Spiny, so.
WebEx has been pretty stable for us. I'm curious what happened with Jason.
Yeah.
His home Wi-Fi, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and just do that then. We'll have Jason. Oh, he said, I just got something in the chat from Allie. He said he was done. His computer just crashed. So that concludes our business for today. Not having Jason here definitely makes it easier to call the day. Thanks everybody for your participation in today's discussions. We will go on recess at this point until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, where we'll take up spiny dogfish specifications. And if Jason does have anything else that he wanted to add, he can add it then before we start spiny dogfish. So again, thank you all. Hopefully sometime soon we'll be able to join each other for hospitality. It's a shame that it's been a couple years now since we've seen each other, but I look forward to the time when we can all get together and enjoy hanging out, going to dinner, and talking about these issues that are so very important to so many people in the Mid-Atlantic and along the East Coast. So enjoy your evenings, everyone, and I look forward to talking with you all tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Take care.
Thank you.